Random House Audiobooks presents Days of Grace by Arthur Ashe and Arnold Rampersad. Read for you by Joe Morton.
Days of Grace. If one's reputation is a possession, then of all my possessions, my reputation means most to me. Nothing comes even close to it in importance. Now and then I have wondered whether my reputation matters too much to me. But I can no more easily renounce my concern with what other people think of me than I can will myself to stop breathing. No matter what I do, or where or when I do it, I feel the eyes of others on me, judging me. Needless to say, I know that a fine line exists between caring about one's reputation and hypocrisy. When I speak of the importance to me of my reputation, I am referring to a reputation that is deserved, not an image cultivated for the public in spite of the facts. I know that I haven't always lived without error or sin, but I also know that I have tried hard to be honest and good at all times. When I fail, my conscience comes alive. I have never sinned or erred without knowing I was being watched. Who was watching me? The living and the dead. My mother, Maddie Cordell Cunningham Ashe, watches me. She died when I was not quite 7. I remember little about her except for 2 images. My last sight of her alive. I was finishing breakfast and she was standing in the side doorway looking lovingly at me. She was dressed in her blue corduroy dressing gown. The day was cool and cloudy. And when I went outside, I heard birds singing in the small oak tree outside our house. And then I remember the last time I saw her, in a coffin at home. She was wearing her best dress, made of pink satin. In her right hand was a single red rose. Roses were her favorite flower, and my daddy had planted them all around the house, big, deep-hued red roses. Every day since then, I have thought about her. I would give anything to stand once again before her, to feel her arms about me, to touch and taste her skin. She is with me every day, watching me in everything I do. Whenever I speak to young persons about the morality of the decisions they make in life, I usually tell them, don't do anything you couldn't tell your mother about. My father is watching me too. My father, whose mouth dropped open when he first saw Jean, my wife. She looked so much like my mother, he said. He is still a force in my life. Some years ago, before he died of a stroke in 1989, I was being interviewed by the television journalist Charlene Hunter Galt in her home. Tell me, Arthur, she said, laughter in her voice, how is it that I have never heard anyone say anything bad about you? How is it that you have never cursed an umpire or punched an opponent, or gotten a little drunk and disorderly? Why are you such a goody-goody? I laughed in turn and told the truth. I guess I have never misbehaved because I'm afraid that if I did anything like that, my father would come straight up from Virginia, find me wherever I happened to be, and kick my ass. When I told that story not long ago on Men's Day at the Westwood Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, everyone smiled and some folks even laughed. They knew what I was talking about. Even those few living in that little enclave of blacks surrounded by whites in Richmond who had never met my father. They knew fathers and mothers exactly like him, who in times past would come up and find you wherever you were and remind you exactly who you were, and don't you forget it. You were their child, that's who. My father was a strong, dutiful, providing man. He lived and died semi-literate. But he owned his own home and held jobs that were important to him and to the people in the community where he lived. His love and his caring were real to me from that Sunday morning in 1950 when he sat on the bottom bunk bed between my brother Johnny and me and told us between wrenching sobs that our mother had died during the night. From that time on, he was father and mother to us, and the lesson he taught above all was about reputation. What people think of you, Arthur Jr., your reputation, is all that counts. Or, as I heard from so many older people as I grew up, a good name is worth more than diamonds and gold. What others think of me is important, and what I think of others is important. What else do I have to go by? Of course, I cannot make decisions based solely on what other people would think. There are moments when the individual must stand alone. Nevertheless, it is crucial to me that people think of me as honest and principled. In turn, to ensure that they do, I must always act in an honest and principled fashion, no matter the cost. One day in Dallas, Texas in 1973, I was playing in the singles final of a World Championship Tennis, WCT, tournament. My opponent was Stan Smith, a brilliant tennis player but an even more impressive human being in his integrity. On one crucial point, I'd watched Smith storm forward, racing to intercept a ball about to bounce a second time on his side of the net. When the point was over, I was sure the ball had bounced twice before he hit it, and that the point was mine. Smith said he had reached the ball in time. The umpire was baffled. The crowd was buzzing. I called Smith up to the net. "Stan, did you get to that ball?" "I did. I got it." I conceded the point. Later, after the match, which I lost, a reporter approached me. Was I so naive? How could I have taken Smith's word on such an important point? "Believe me," I assured him, "I am not a fool. I wouldn't take just anybody's word for it, but if Stan Smith says he got to the ball, he got to it. I trust his character." When I was not quite 18 years old, I played a tournament in Wheeling, West Virginia, the Middle Atlantic Junior Championships. As happened much of the time when I was growing up, I was the only black kid in the tournament, at least in the under-18 age section. One night, some of the other kids trashed a cabin. They absolutely destroyed it. And then they decided to say that I was responsible, although I had nothing to do with it. The incident even got into the papers. As much as I denied and protested, those white boys would not change their story. I rode to Washington from West Virginia with the parents of Dickie Dell, another one of the players. They tried to reassure me, but it was an uncomfortable ride because I was silently worrying about what my father would do and say to me. When I reached Washington, where I was to play in another tournament, I telephoned him in Richmond. As I was aware, he already knew about the incident. When we spoke, he was grim. But he had one question only. "Arthur Jr., all I want to know is, were you mixed up in that mess?" "No, Daddy, I wasn't." He never asked about it again. He trusted me. With my father, my reputation was solid. I have tried to live so that people would trust my character as I trusted Stan Smith's. Sometimes I think it is almost a weakness in me. But I want to be seen as fair and honest, trustworthy, kind, calm, and polite. I want no stain on my character, no blemish on my reputation. And that was why what happened to me early in April 1992 hit me as hard as it did. The night before I met Jimmy Connors in the men's singles final at Wimbledon in the summer of 1975, I went to bed and slept soundly. That match was the biggest of my life. It was also one that just about everybody was sure I would lose, because Connors was then the finest tennis player in the world, virtually invincible. In fact, the match was supposed to be a slaughter, and I was to be the sacrificial lamb. Before going to bed, I had talked and talked with various friends about strategy and tactics. But it was time to go to sleep. I shrugged off all the nervousness and the worrying, as I usually do, and slept peacefully as that proverbial lamb. The night of Tuesday, April 7, 1992, was another matter altogether. Try as I could, I was not able to deliver myself to sleep. Once again, I had talked and talked, this time mainly with my wife at home, but also with friends on the telephone. Once again, we discussed strategy and tactics as I tried to make myself ready for another ordeal. But one far more threatening to me than 4 sets in the final at Wimbledon against Connors. This time I could not bring myself to sleep, except in fits and starts. From my windows on the 14th floor of my apartment building in Manhattan, I saw the lights of the city and watched for the sun to come up through the murk and mist of Brooklyn and Queens to the east. Before 6 o'clock, with the sky still dark, I was dressed and ready to go, ready to hunt for a newspaper to discover if my secret was out, exposed to the world. I knew that once that happened, my life and the lives of my family would be changed forever, and almost certainly for the worse. In a shop across the avenue, I found the newspaper I was waiting for, USA Today. I scanned the front page, then flipped back to the sports section. There was not a word about me. I felt a great relief. And then I knew that the relief was only temporary, that it was now up to me to take the matter into my own hands and break the news to whatever part of the world wanted to hear it. And I would have to do it that day, Wednesday, because the days, maybe the hours, of my secret were definitely numbered. I had to announce to the world that I, Arthur Ashe, had AIDS. The afternoon before was supposed to have been a normal time for me. A visit from a boyhood friend, a medical appointment at the Westchester Diagnostic Center in nearby White Plains, Westchester County, a tennis clinic, then back home in time to play with my daughter Camera, and then to have dinner with her and Jean. The medical appointment was all too normal for me. Since December 1979, when I'd undergone a quadruple bypass heart operation in New York, I had become a professional patient, although only my wife and closest friends, as well as my physicians, knew the full story of my career as a patient. So the medical appointment was normal with me undergoing an MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging of my brain, which is like the better-known CAT scan, but uses magnetism, not X-rays, to capture its images. Normal, too, was the visit from my boyhood friend, Doug Smith. I make it a point to keep in touch with friends from my childhood in Richmond. I cannot help but think that childhood friends are the bedrock of all one's future relationships, and that you move away from them at your risk. There is an African proverb in which I believe: hold on to your friends with both hands. I try to stay in touch. Doug was a long-time friend, newly remarried, and I was glad he was coming to visit. We had played tennis as teenagers. He had gone to Phoenix High School in Hampton, Virginia, and I had gone to Maggie Walker in Richmond. But we had remained friends. He had gone on to Hampton Institute, as it was then called, and I had gone on to UCLA, but tennis had kept us together. Doug is a tennis writer for USA Today. When he called to ask if he could come to see me, I assumed that he wanted to discuss with me my 3-volume work on African Americans in sports, A Hard Road to Glory, and we did talk about it for a while, sitting in my office at home. Then it became clear that something else was on his mind. "Arthur, I've got to ask you something," he said. I could see that he was in pain, agonizing and wanting to be doing almost anything else than to ask me that question. "We have just gotten a lead at the newspaper, something about you, and my boss has asked me to follow up on the lead. I'm supposed to talk to you and ask you to confirm or deny it." "What sort of lead, Doug?" He didn't rush to answer, but he finally came out with it. "We have heard that you are HIV positive, Arthur, that you have AIDS. Can you prove it?" "No, that's the point. My editor wants to know, is it true? They sent me to find out. Is it true?" Doug was a good friend and a good man, but right now he was the press, and I was not about to deliver myself to the press on this question without a struggle. In fact, I could feel my anger rising, slowly but steadily, although it was not aimed at Doug himself. I am not one to be plagued by fits or gusts of rage, and I try hard to keep calm and subdued at all times. I was taught to remain calm on the tennis court, no matter what the score or how questionable the call or discourteous my opponent. But the anger was building in me that this newspaper, any newspaper, or any part of the media could think that it had a right to tell the world that I had AIDS. "I want to talk to your editor, Doug." I could see that Doug was relieved at that point, happy to turn the matter over to his boss. From my office as we sat there at home, I telephoned Gene Polichinsky, managing editor of sports for USA Today. Polichinsky couldn't talk right then, and Doug and I waited for him to return my call. He did so promptly enough around 4:30. We talked for between 20 and 30 minutes. He was fairly direct. "Are you HIV positive, or do you have AIDS?" "Could be," I replied. I could not lie to him. Sometimes, indirectly, I had to lie about AIDS. Now and then I had to lie about it directly. In November 1991, when I wanted to go to South Africa, I lied on the application for my visa and said that I did not have an infectious disease. I never lied without a sharp twinge of conscience. even in lying to the government of South Africa. I also told Polaczynski flatly that I had no intention at that time of confirming or denying the story. I tried to argue with him, to make him see my position. "Look," I said with some force, "the public has no right to know in this case." As I saw this situation, the public's right to know really meant the newspaper's right to print. Of course, there would be people interested in, even titillated by the news that I had AIDS. The question was, did they have a right to know? I absolutely did not think so. The law was on the side of the newspaper, but ethically its demand was wrong, as well as unnecessary. "I am not a public figure anymore," I argued. "I don't play professional tennis anymore. I officially announced my retirement in 1980. I am not running for public office, so my health is no one's legitimate concern except my own. I haven't committed any crimes, so I am not fair game. I haven't been caught in any scandals. Why do you think differently?" "You are a public figure," Polaczynski insisted, "and any time a public figure is ill, it's news. If he has a heart attack, as you did in 1979, it's news. We have no special zone of treatment for AIDS. It's a disease like heart disease. It is news." Match point had come, and I had lost it. All I could do now was try to control the announcement itself, to have it heard first directly from me and not as a blazing story in a national newspaper. I asked Polaczynski if I could have a little time, say 36 hours, to call friends, talk to other journalists, and prepare a public statement. I reminded him that I had not confirmed his story, as far as I was concerned. Polaczynski was polite but firm. No, it was not his role as the managing editor of a newspaper to help me plan a news conference, and he could not in good conscience withhold a story if he considered it newsworthy and if he had proof of its accuracy. However, USA Today had certain standards and practices which it would stick by in this story as in any other. In general, it did not print stories with elaborately vague sources, information attributed to informed sources and the like. And the newspaper did not approve of backing crab-like into a story by reporting a rumor and then declaring that the person or persons involved had denied it. Polaczynski and I ended the conversation without coming to any agreement, except that I stood by my refusal to confirm the story, and he stood by his determination to continue to investigate it, as well as his right to publish it if he could find confirmation. I fully expected to see the story in the next morning's edition. I like USA Today. In fact, I have the paper delivered to my home every day. In its beginning, and even now, some people deride it as McPaper, a kind of fast food approach to journalism. The truth is that it is an extremely informative newspaper, attractive and dependable, and well-written. And if you travel as much as I do, it keeps you abreast of events around the country and the world. At that moment, however, I hated the paper for what it was doing, although I was also glad that it was making a conscientious effort to determine if the story were true. It had given me time, much needed time. I had to decide what to do next. First, I canceled my MRI. I canceled the tennis clinic, which was for my own Safe Passage Foundation, working with young people in Newark, New Jersey. The next day, I was supposed to go to Washington, D.C., to be with my old tennis partners Stan Smith and Donald Dell, who was my lawyer and one of my closest friends, and speak to the Washington tennis patrons at the William G. Fitzgerald Tennis Center, where the center court is named after me. I canceled that appointment, too. Then Jean and I began to talk. We talked for hours that day, looking at the problem from every possible angle, trying to come up with the best plan. In one way or another, Jean and I had already had this conversation many times. From the start, we had understood that the truth would eventually come out, and that basically we had three choices about the revelation. The first was to make the announcement ourselves when and where we wanted. The second was to wait until the rumors began to build, until the story seemed about to break, than to try to preempt the announcement ourselves. The third choice, easily the worst, was to wait until the announcement was a fait accompli, until one of us turned on the television or picked up a newspaper and saw a picture of my face and the report of a rumor, or until some reporter called on the telephone to say, "Mr. Ashe, sir, Associated Press is running a wire story about you. It says you have AIDS. Any comments, sir?" Then we would have totally lost control of our lives. We had decided long before that if we could not implement Plan A, then we absolutely had to execute Plan B. And now it had to be done the next day. Although she later told me that I was wrong, quite wrong, I was sure Jean was relieved that the truth was finally going to come out. I suppose that I have a deeper commitment to keeping things to myself, bottling them up, suppressing them. I tend to be more on guard. But we both knew that our lives would be changed forever by the announcement, even if we didn't know exactly how and to what extent. I could see, too, that we were part of a larger pattern concerning AIDS and publicity, that our announcement could not be cleanly divorced from similar announcements by other persons of some celebrity. Although light needed to be shed on AIDS, very few people were willing to admit to being infected with the HIV virus, much less the disease itself. Before Magic Johnson went public the previous November about his HIV infection, no prominent heterosexual had admitted publicly to being HIV positive or to having AIDS, unless he or she were on his or her deathbed. One could argue that Magic did not have much of a choice in making his announcement, in that he would have had to explain why he was retiring as a basketball player at the height of his game, apparently without an injury. He could not have feigned a career-threatening injury even if he had wanted to, because the integrity of his physicians would have been on the line. Rock Hudson admitted his infection only near the very end. Only after the death of Brad Davis, who starred in the movie Midnight Express, did anyone admit that he had died of AIDS. Willie Smith, the gifted black clothing designer, died without admitting he had AIDS. The entertainer Peter Allen died after my announcement, but never came forward before his death to tell the world that he was infected. Rudolph Nureyev forced his doctor into the position of initially denying after the dancer's death that he had died of AIDS. Public attitudes have changed and become more enlightened, and still AIDS patients who are public figures tremble at announcing their infection. Cancer, once almost as unspeakable, is one thing, and AIDS is quite another. One can be sure that there are many famous people who are HIV positive or who have full-blown AIDS and are keeping it a secret. As for myself, I never worried as much about being a social outcast as I did about not being able to maintain my life's schedule. On visa applications, on job applications, in seeking medical treatment or insurance, and in myriad other ways, AIDS is enough in many cases to result in a blunt rejection. Brad Davis's wife confessed that Davis had kept his illness a secret so that he could continue to take whatever acting jobs came his way. I love to travel, and I have to do so for business, such as going to Wimbledon as a television commentator. But several countries will not admit someone who admits to having AIDS, or even to being merely HIV positive but without full-blown AIDS. The United States is one of those countries. One can get a temporary dispensation, but usually only if one is attending a conference about AIDS or the like. The infected person would then be accorded the same status as Soviet diplomats used to have in the United States during the Cold War, with severe limits placed on his or her travel. The major international conference on AIDS in 1992 was forced to move from Boston to Amsterdam in the Netherlands because of these restrictions. Because Great Britain also has restrictions connected to HIV and AIDS, I wondered if I would ever see Wimbledon again. I wondered about my commercial connections, my consultantships and other jobs in television, and in the manufacture and sale of sports equipment and clothing and in coaching. All of these connections went back a long way and represented a tremendous human investment on my part as well as on the part of those companies. Would these connections survive the news? For the news conference, Gene and I decided to appeal to home box office, HBO, for whom I had worked regularly as a television commentator at Wimbledon. The president of Paramount Sports there is Seth Abraham, a close friend. He agreed at once to do it. We set the announcement for 3:30 the following afternoon. With HBO undertaking to notify the sports press, two major tasks remained. The first was to prepare a statement to be read at the conference before I took questions from any reporters who showed up. The second, at least as difficult for me, was to call a number of people and break the news to them. To a few already in the know, I would be telling them only that I was going public. Others would be hearing about my AIDS infection for the first time. Between roughly 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon and 2:45 the following morning, I made between 30 and 35 telephone calls. I called several members of my family, including my brother in North Carolina, who was a retired Marine Corps captain, and my stepmother, stepsister, and stepbrother in Virginia. and I called many friends. Hearing the news that I had AIDS, 2 or 3 people burst into tears. I hastened to tell them, and others, that I was fine, that my spirits were up, that they should not worry about me. I called my lawyer, Donald Dell, and he let me know at once that he would be present at the press conference. I called the Chief of Staff in the office of Dr. Lewis Sullivan, the Secretary of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. I asked him to inform Dr. Sullivan, and I wanted Dr. Sullivan himself to pass the news to Barbara Bush at the White House. I had been favorably impressed by Mrs. Bush's steadfast interest in AIDS and the generosity of her response to its victims when she visited children's hospitals. From the president of the National Commission on AIDS, I secured its list of medical reporters who might be interested in what I had to say. They, too, would be invited to the press conference. Several of the people I called had either answering services or answering machines, but I was extremely cautious in leaving messages. I was guarded even in talking to certain spouses. Some I knew I could trust. Others were less reliable. To help me draft the text of my statement, I called my old friend Frank DeFord, a veteran sports journalist and television personality, and now a senior writer at Newsweek magazine. DeFord is the spitting image of the handsome riverboat gambler, rakish mustache and all, but there is nothing hit or miss about his literary style or his common sense. Co-author with me of Arthur Ashe, Portrait in Motion, which is an account of a year in my life on the professional tennis circuit, he had traveled with me to a number of places, including sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa. Together we had gone to Soweto, the most famous or infamous black township in South Africa. Although I would write a statement myself, I trusted DeFord's judgment on what I should say at this particular time. As I worked at my computer, the telephone rang steadily as word began to spread. Instead of Barbara Bush, President Bush himself called to express his sympathy and to wish us well. Another caller was Douglas Wilder, an old friend who had become the governor of the state where I was born, Virginia. I also heard from Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta. Young, an ordained minister, had married Jean and me in 1978. I heard from my good friend David Dinkins, the mayor of New York and an avid tennis fan. I took every call, even those that had nothing to do with my announcement. I needed to feel that the world was still turning normally on its axis. Someone called about changing the bylaws of an organization of which I am a member. I listened patiently and talked the matter through as intelligently as I could. As I talked and wrote, I was aware above all of one person's presence in the apartment. My 5-year-old daughter, Camera. I could hardly look at her without thinking of how innocent she was of the import of this coming event, and how in one way or another she was bound to suffer for it. She is a beautiful child, if I say so myself. She was wearing yellow and pink barrettes in her hair, and her smile went right to my heart. She had been tested and does not carry the virus. We had not told her about my AIDS, but now we had to do so, and soon, perhaps that night. We had to tell her before someone, most likely some other child, taunted her with the fact that her father has AIDS. In the apartment where the phone was ringing more than ever, and there were visitors in the middle of the morning, she knew that something was happening but didn't know what. "Daddy," she said, and hugged me about my knees. She held out her right hand, which was closed. When she opened it, there was a chocolate kiss in its bright silver wrapper. I kissed her on her cheek and went back to my statement. When I was finished, I read the statement to Jean and Frank, and they approved of it. There was enough time for a quick lunch, and then I changed into a blue suit and red tie, just right for television, if anyone showed up from television. Jean, too, was dressed in a blue suit, with a white blouse and a blue velvet headband, as we went with DeFord to the HBO office on the corner of 47th Street and the Avenue of the Americas. We arrived just before the scheduled start of the conference at 3:30 p.m. Ross Levinson, who handles publicity for HBO, greeted us in the lobby. "How's the turnout?" I asked him nervously. "Anybody here yet?" "Anybody here?" he echoed. "The place is packed. It's been packed for an hour now." I asked about the room. "You've probably seen it on television," Levinson assured me. "It's where we hold some of our biggest fight announcements. Evander Holyfield, George Foreman, Mike Tyson, they've all been in there, talking about their coming fights." Oh, great, I thought. Just great. Almost exactly at 3:30, I entered the conference room on the 15th floor of the building. The room, warm and humid, was indeed jammed with reporters. The podium groaned with microphones. Like Holyfield, Foreman, and Tyson, I made my entrance with an entourage. My cardiologist, Dr. Stephen Scheid, and my AIDS physician, Dr. Henry F. Murray of New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, Edgar Mandeville, a close friend of mine who was also a physician, Donald Dell, Mayor Dinkins, and Jean. I half expected to hear the bell sound for round one. When I moved to the podium to explain why I had called the conference, I started with a joke. George Steinbrenner has asked me to manage the Yankees, I said. In the tumultuous reign of Steinbrenner as principal owner of the Yankees baseball team, so many managers had been hired and fired that it was hard to keep count. But I graciously declined. Nobody laughed, which not infrequently happens with my jokes. Then I told my story. Rumors and half-truths have been floating about concerning my medical condition since my heart attack on July 31st, 1979, I began. I had my first heart bypass operation 6 months later on December 13th, 1979, and a second in June 1983. But beginning with my admittance to New York Hospital for brain surgery in September 1988, some of you heard that I had tested positive for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. That is indeed the case. The virus had been transmitted through a blood transfusion during one of my open-heart surgeries, almost certainly the second in 1983. Testing for HIV in donated blood did not begin until 2 years later in 1985. In 1988, after I underwent brain surgery, it was confirmed that I have AIDS. After my right hand had lost all motor function, a biopsy of brain tissue detected the presence of toxoplasmosis, which is one of the opportunistic infections that mark the presence of AIDS. Blood tests had proved positive for HIV. Why hadn't I gone public in 1988? The answer is simple. Any admission of HIV infection at that time would have seriously, permanently, and my wife and I believed unnecessarily, infringed upon our family's right to privacy. Just as I am sure that everybody in this room has some personal matter that he or she would like to keep private, so did we. There was certainly no compelling medical or physical necessity to go public with my medical condition. I have it on good authority that my status was common knowledge in the medical community, and I am truly grateful to all of you, medical and otherwise, who knew but either didn't even ask me or never made it public. What I actually came to feel about a year ago was that there was a silent and generous conspiracy to assist me in maintaining my privacy. That has meant a great deal to me in Jean and Camera. Once I started to talk about my family, I could feel my emotions bubbling and surging to the surface, and especially so when I thought of Camera. I tried to continue reading, but her beautiful brown face swam before me and I felt the tears flooding my eyes, and my throat simply would not open to let out the words. I waited and waited, but I am not sure I would ever have been able to continue. I then asked Jean to step to the microphones and read the words for me. This has meant a great deal to me and Jean, and Camera, she read. She does already know that perfect strangers come up to Daddy on the street and say hi. Even though we've begun preparing Camera for this news, beginning tonight, Jean and I must teach her how to react to new, different, and sometimes cruel comments that have little to do with her reality. I did not want to be hard on USA Today, but I had to talk about what had caused me to break my silence. The newspaper had, I said, put me in the unenviable position of having to lie if I wanted to protect our privacy. No one should have to make that choice. I am sorry that I have been forced to make this revelation now. I then revealed that Jean and Camera were in excellent health. Both had been tested and both were HIV negative. What of the future for me? I have been an activist on many issues in the past. Against apartheid, for education and the athlete, the need for faster change in tennis. I will continue with those projects in progress, and will certainly get involved with the AIDS crisis. I mentioned Irvin Magic Johnson and said that I thought we might work together. I ended with a reflection about what was to come. The quality of one's life changes irrevocably when something like this becomes public. Reason and rational thought are too often waived out of fear, caution, or just plain ignorance. My family and I must now learn a new set of behavioral standards to function in the everyday world. And sadly, there really was no good reason for this to have happened now. But it has happened. And we will adjust and go forward. For about 45 more minutes, I took questions from the reporters and others present. "How do you feel?" someone asked. "I'm not sick," I assured them. "I have good days and I have bad days." The good day, bad day ratio is about 6 to 1. I mentioned some of the drugs I am taking for AIDS. Did I plan to sue the hospital where I received the tainted blood? No. I had no intention of suing anyone. I am not litigious by nature, and a lawsuit would serve no purpose because I blamed no one. "Do I feel forced out?" someone asked. Absolutely. If the person hadn't called the newspaper, I'd still be leading a normal life. Did I have advice for AIDS sufferers? Yes, I did. Take care, because you never know what breakthrough lies around the corner. Then it was over. Flanked by Jean and David Dinkins, I left the room. A remark I had made to Doug Smith earlier in the day came back to me as I walked away. In a way, I had said to him about the announcement, it's sort of akin to walking out of the confessional booth in the Catholic Church. You're supposed to come out feeling better. Certainly there's a self-imposed burden when you keep something like this to yourself. It's one of those things that cries out for revelation. Just to tell someone. I indeed felt a certain sense of relief at having made the announcement, but in no way had I been cleansed. The analogy between my statement and the Roman Catholic confessional was not a good one. I had not committed a sin, one that could be absolved either by a news conference or a priest. The truth is that I had been made to feel guilty without having committed a sin. First, there was the sense of guilt that surrounds the acquisition of a disease, and especially a disease like AIDS that is linked sensationally in the public mind to deviant sex and drug abuse. Then there was the guilt implied in the newspaper's determination to break the story. My guilt in having deliberately kept the secret from the people. However, I had been guilty of nothing. Doug, who is a Roman Catholic himself, understood what I meant in making the connection, but still felt badly about his role in the affair. I thought I knew why my boyhood friend felt so bad. He could not be sure that I believed that his newspaper had received the tip that I had AIDS from someone else. Perhaps he had taken the rumor to his editor, but I believed him. In any event, he could console himself that he had acted completely above board, from the viewpoint of journalistic ethics. He had not wormed the story out of me, then published it. I went out of my way to make sure that Doug understood that I bore him no ill will, none whatsoever. About 5 weeks later, Doug sent Jean and me a touching letter about what he called the fiasco in New York, in which he confessed to the disturbance in my soul caused by my role in the experience. Nevertheless, he believed that this traumatic event and my role in it were meant to be. The Lord, as my mother used to explain when logic was elusive, sometimes works in mysterious ways. I couldn't bring myself to blame Doug himself for anything, and I certainly didn't have him in mind when I told the news conference that someone had ratted on me. Still, something in his letter didn't sit well with me. Although he surely hadn't intended it in his letter, he had identified the role of the press, specifically USA Today, with the Lord. I was pretty certain at the time that Jesus Christ or Jehovah was not on the staff of that newspaper. In his appeal to Scripture, I thought I saw a claim to the divine right of the press. I am a firm believer in the freedom of the press and in the First Amendment broadly construed. I knew more than a little bit about the history of press censorship in the United States from John Peter Zenger down to our time, but I was still angry every time I thought about what the press had done to me. Was I justified in claiming that I had a right to privacy? Or was USA Today justified in asserting its privilege? For the record, the newspaper had acted with some deliberation. The editors had decided at about 11 o'clock on Tuesday evening, the day before my announcement, not to carry the story. The decision had involved not simply Polichinsky but also Peter Pritchard, the editor of the paper. With some accuracy, USA Today could assert, and did assert, that it never broke the story. Once I had made my decision, the newspaper enjoyed only a minor scoop of sorts. At 1 o'clock, before my conference, it sent the story to the newspaper's international edition, which mainly reaches Europe and Asia. The story was also sent to the Gannett News Service, which supplies a chain of 80 newspapers including USA Today, as well as cable news network, CNN. Tennis great Arthur Ashe has AIDS, the item began. He will announce Wednesday afternoon at a New York press conference. No one could doubt, however, who had forced my hand. To my surprise and my satisfaction, this aspect of my announcement generated great controversy. More than 700 letters reached USA Today on the issue of my right to privacy, and about 95% vehemently opposed the newspaper's position. In other newspapers, the story created less of a stir, but still attracted a surprising number of letters and comments, often angrily expressed. "I didn't want to turn on the television or read a newspaper ever again," a woman in Indianapolis wrote. "I cried last night, and I'm crying today. Shame on USA Today." "I think USA Today is a villain this morning," one man from Charlotte, North Carolina wrote. Among famous tennis players, long accustomed to the ways of the press, at least two had comments. "It's like the press has given up a touch of humanity," Chris Everett told a reporter. And Billie Jean King, who certainly had been burned badly by publicity, remarked knowingly, "It's almost like your life becomes a competition between members of the media." A few readers felt differently. A woman in Salem, Oregon wrote the newspaper to completely support your story on Arthur Ashe. He was not secretive about his life-threatening heart problem, and the whole thing about his particular situation is the stigma attached. That stigma is the thing that needs to be changed. I thank you for running the story. As the adverse criticism rolled into USA Today, with 481 telephone calls, most of them negative, and 60 canceled subscriptions by 7 p.m. the following day, its editor took to the pages to defend the role of the newspaper in the affair. "Not to have followed up the lead," argued Pritchard, "would have been to help me keep my secret." "Generally," he insisted, "I think it's a mistake for journalists to keep secrets, or to protect some friends who happen to be public figures, but not others." Citing some famous instances of the American press keeping a secret, such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's paralysis or Woodrow Wilson's stroke, that conspiracy of silence has not served the public. Ashe is not a public official, but for many people, young and old, he's probably as influential as any president. By sharing the story, Ashe and his family are free of a great weight. I was flattered by his assessment of my influence and by the comparisons to Roosevelt and Wilson, if only through our various infirmities. But my family and I did not now feel ourselves free of a burden. Camera, for one, had not been aware of any weight at all, but now had to assume one. Jean and I may have put down one heavy weight, but we had certainly picked up another, and one far more imposing. In the days that followed my announcement, several other newspapers, journalists, and organizations joined in the debate, quite apart from the many ordinary citizens who wrote to magazines and newspapers to express their opinion. The New York Times reported a wave of public criticism of news organizations that was joined by some who have normally been among the press's staunchest champions. And indeed, the executive director of the Reporters' Committee for the Freedom of the Press said, of the position taken by USA Today, "My visceral reaction was that this is the kind of thing that's going to get us regulated." Several writers who defended my position used a special term, outed, to describe what had been done to me. The term refers to the growing practice among militant gays of deliberately publicizing the names of well-known individuals who are homosexual but live in the closet. The aim, as I understand it, is both to discourage hypocrisy and to increase the power of gays by showing how pervasive gay culture really is. Ellen Goodman, the respected columnist and associate editor of the Boston Globe, called my case the medical equivalent of an outing. She also called Polachinsky's explanation pretentious. Another syndicated columnist, Dwayne Wickham, wrote that I deserved the same privacy considerations routinely given to rape victims. Like them, I should not be twice victimized by being made to suffer the harsh glare of the public spotlight. Anna Quindlen, a syndicated columnist for the New York Times, eloquently went back and forth, caught in a dilemma that was evidently heartfelt. I am disquieted by the Arthur Ashe story, she wrote. I can't help but feel that in the medical sense, we outed him, a practice that, in the sexual sense, I deplore. That's the human being talking. The reporter understands public figure, big news. And, she wrote, privacy, privacy. The white light of the press and the closed doors of our homes are two of the most deeply prized aspects of our lives as Americans. It just so happens that they are often in direct opposition to each other. Raymond R. Coffey, editor of the editorial page of Chicago Sun-Times, conceding that his position would be counted treason in some quarters, supported me. What the news media, most specifically USA Today, did to Arthur Ashe, he argued, was, in my view, something for all of us to be ashamed of. Despite all of these vigorous attacks on the approach taken by USA Today, however, support for its position among editors and other journalists was clearly strong. One poll of 7 editors who were then visiting Washington for the annual meeting of the American Society of Newspaper Editors revealed that 6 of the 7 would have acted as USA Today had done. An editorial in the New York Times accused me of aiming my barbs at the wrong target. Instead of being annoyed with the person who had put out the word about my condition, or with USA Today, I should have aimed at the cruel and benighted public attitudes that compelled Mr. Ashe to keep his disease secret for 3 years. Needless to say, I consider the Times' position self-serving. The day after my press conference, I made sure to keep the 2 appointments on my calendar because I was anxious to see how people would respond to me after the announcement. I was thinking not only about the people I knew personally, even intimately, but also about waiters and bartenders, doormen and taxi drivers. I knew all the myths and fears about AIDS. I also understood that if I hadn't been educated in the harshest possible way, by contracting the disease and living with it, I would probably share some of those myths and fears. I knew that I couldn't spread the disease by coughing or breathing or using plates and cups in a restaurant. But I knew that in some places my plates and cups would receive special attention, perhaps some extra soap and hot water. Perhaps they would be smashed and thrown away. That morning I accompanied Donald M. Stewart, head of the College Board Testing Service, on a visit to the offices of the New York Community Trust. We were seeking a grant of $5,000 to support the publication of a handbook aimed at student athletes. The appointment went well. We got the money. And in the evening, I went in black tie to a gala dinner to celebrate the 80th birthday of a man I had known for 30 years and regarded as one of my key mentors in New York City, Joseph Cullman III, a former chairman of Philip Morris. At the event, which took place at the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, I felt anxiety rising as our taxi drew up to the curb. How would the other guests respond to me? The first person I saw was an old friend, John Reese. An investment banker now, in his youth John had been an up-and-coming star with me in junior tennis. He saw me and hurried over. There was no mistaking the warmth of his greeting, his genuine concern, but also his understanding of my predicament. We walked inside together, and I had a fine time at the celebration. Did I feel a sense of shame, however subdued, about having AIDS, although I was guilty of nothing in contracting it? Very little. I could not shake off completely the irrational sense of guilt, but I did my best to keep it in check, to recognize that it was based on nothing substantial. I was glad, in this context, that I had not concealed my condition from certain people. I had reminded myself from the outset that I had an obligation to tell anyone who might be materially hurt by the news when it came out. I have been both proud of my commercial connections and grateful to the people who asked me to represent them or work for them in some other way. Several of them had taken a chance on me when they knew full well, from the most basic market research in the early 1970s, that having an African American as a spokesman or an officer might cost them business. Among these organizations, the most important were the Aetna Life and Casualty Company, where I was a member of the board of directors, Head USA, the sports equipment manufacturer that had given me my first important commercial endorsement, a tennis racket with my very own autograph on it, the Doral Resort and Country Club in Florida, where I had directed the tennis program, Le Coq Sportif, the sports clothing manufacturer, Home Box Office, the cable television network for which I worked as an analyst at Wimbledon, and ABC Sports, for which I also served as commentator. Not one of these companies had dropped me after I quietly revealed to their most important executives that I had AIDS. Now those executives had to deal with the response of the public. I would have to give them a chance to put some distance between their companies and me because I now carried the most abominable and intimidating medical virus of our age. In business, image is everything. And one would have to go back to leprosy or the plague to find a disease so full of terrifying implications as AIDS carries. AIDS was a scientific mystery that defied our vaunted claims for science, and also a religious or spiritual riddle, at least to those who insisted on thinking of it as possibly a punishment from God for our evil on earth, as more than one person had publicly suggested. As far as I am concerned, these companies did not owe me anything. They had products and services to sell and employees and stockholders and their families who were dependent on them. If I hurt their business, I believe, they would be obliged to revise our arrangements. I would not have waved my contract in anyone's face or hidden behind an ingenious lawyer. I understand business and free enterprise. My university degree is in the field of business administration, and I have profited from business and the free enterprise system. I waited for phone calls and the signs that my services were no longer needed. None came. I read somewhere that in the 2 weeks following his announcement that he was HIV positive, Irvin Magic Johnson received thousands of pieces of mail, and that months later he was still receiving hundreds of letters a week. Well, I received nothing approaching that volume of correspondence following my press conference, but I certainly had a mountain of reading and writing to do in its aftermath. And every time I appeared on one of the few television interview shows I agreed to do, such as with Barbara Walters or Larry King, there was another surge of correspondence. I heard from the famous and the completely unknown, people I knew and people I had never met. The most moving letters, without a doubt, came from people who had lived through an AIDS illness, either their own or that of a loved one. Often the loved one was now dead. These writers, above all, understood why I had made such a fuss about the issue of privacy. Many probably understood better than I did, because they were more vulnerable than I am and had suffered more. One Manhattan woman wrote to tell me about her father, who had received HIV-tainted blood, as I had, through a blood transfusion following heart surgery. Without knowing it, he had passed the infection on to her mother. For some years, they had kept their illness a secret from their daughter. After they could keep the secret from her no longer, she, in turn, had worked to keep their secret from other family members and friends, and from the world. Although both parents were now dead, she wrote, I share your anger at that anonymous person who violated either your trust or their professional ethics. A grandmother in New England, HIV positive after a transfusion, shared with me her terror that the company she worked for would dismiss her if they found out. She was awaiting the passage of a law that might protect her. From Idaho, a mother told me about her middle-aged son who had tried to keep his AIDS condition a secret even from her. My son kept it to himself for 6 months before he told me, and I'll never forget that day as we cried together. His ordeal included dementia, forced incarceration in a state asylum, and ostracism by relatives and friends. But mother and son had spent his last 4 difficult months together. I am so thankful to have had those days with him. As for my daughter, Camera, more than one writer underscored my fears about what she might have to undergo from insensitive people in the future. A woman whose son had died of AIDS about a year before following the death of his wife was now bringing up their young son. She wrote, "I struggle with how this little child is going to deal with the insults and rejections that people will inflict on him when they find out that his father died from AIDS." Perhaps the most unusual letter I received from someone with an ailing relative came from a woman in Florida who offered an anguished apology to me and others who had been infected from blood transfusions. As she told it, her mother had become HIV positive 2 years before, following a personal history of drug addiction. I realize that your situation, and many others who have contracted the virus, has been caused by people like my mother who have lived their lives with such disregard for the sanctity of human life. Needless to say, I am grateful to all those who have taken the trouble to write. Most of the letters left me humbled. Among those famous people who wrote immediately after my announcement was Nelson Mandela, who was one of my genuine heroes, and whom I had met both in South Africa and here at home. He sent a long letter on the stationery of the African National Congress of South Africa. "I can never forget my own joy at meeting you," he wrote. "I hope you feel my embrace across the continents and that it serves to let you know that we love you and wish you well." Elizabeth Taylor, whose work on behalf of AIDS sufferers is to her eternal credit, sent a bouquet of tulips and a lovely note. "My thoughts, prayers, and admirations are with you and your family." I had never met her. Some months later, I read a story about her AIDS work in Vanity Fair and was startled to see my name. She had been annoyed when a colleague in their AIDS foundation, American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, contacted Magic Johnson after his announcement to try to get him to join their effort. "I don't want to use him," she said about Magic. "It's the same with Arthur Ashe." She called my press treatment appalling. The way somebody chooses to die is their own goddamn business. In addition to the telephone call from President Bush, I also received kind letters from former Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. An avid sportsman, Nixon had credited a meeting with me years before with stirring his interest in tennis. Given his wars with the press, I was not surprised that he backed my position against USA Today. He wrote, "Your privacy should have been respected." Ford evidently concurred. "Betty and I congratulate you on your superb handling of a very difficult and personal matter. You and Mrs. Ashe have our highest admiration and affection." Much more surprising to me was a letter from Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, whose own television ordeal I had watched with dread fascination and without being convinced of his guilt or indeed his innocence. "You have been an inspiration to me for most of my life," he wrote. "I admire and respect you. I will continue to remember you and your family in my prayers." A woman who had cleaned my hotel room during a tournament in Tucson, Arizona, 15 years before in 1975, wrote to Frank DeFord after reading a story of his about me in Newsweek. She praised my kindness, gentleness, and serenity. I was glad to get her letter. Many tennis players called or sent me cards, notes, and letters, including Charlie Passerelle, one of my best friends from tennis and someone I've known since I was 14, and Pam Shriver, who generously sent a contribution in my name to the United Negro College Fund. Many of these letters brought back powerful memories or associations, as did one from the outstanding golfer Gary Player. We had had our differences about his country, South Africa, where I had been banned twice, and about apartheid, which he could never bring himself to attack and which I found impossible for anyone to defend. Telling me about an educational foundation he had started in South Africa, he sent his sympathy and kind wishes. He wrote, "Whilst we have perhaps at times had different views on South Africa in the past, I think we have both shared a common interest in people and mankind and have tried to contribute to society as a whole. race and politics crossing medicine and disease. One card I received called me an inspiration to many people during your career. Our thoughts and prayers are with you and your family as you face this new challenge. It was signed, A White Family in Mississippi. Believe me, these letters helped. I think I know better than to believe that all or even most of the praise heaped on me is deserved. But I felt good to know that so many people thought so highly of me. On the other hand, I know that sympathy clouds the judgment, especially when the object of sympathy has an illness we think of as terminal, or an illness that is terminal. I began to have a sense in reading many of the letters and the essays on me in newspapers and magazines that I was reading my obituary. But I could not say, as Mark Twain did, that the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. Exaggerated, but not greatly. One Sunday evening that fall, I was reading to Camera when she was in bed, as I do every night when I can, and now she was drifting off peacefully to sleep. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and asked, "Daddy, how did you get AIDS?" I shuddered. I hadn't expected the question at all. Certainly not now, not dredged up, as it were, from her subconscious, where it obviously had been stirring a while. In the wake of my public announcement, in fact, that very evening in April, Jean and I had tried to talk to Camera about my illness. As I said, we did not want her to find out about it through the taunts of a classmate or through the blunderings of some well-meaning adult. Now and then she had asked Jean some casual questions about my medicine and my illness, but this was her first expression of arguably the most intimate question anyone could ask me about the illness. "Well," I told her, "it was like this. I was in the hospital. I had to have an operation. During an operation, you can lose a lot of blood. And after the operation, to feel better, I got a blood transfusion to replace some of the blood I had lost. I was given blood that somebody had given to the hospital for people like me. The blood turned out to be bad." "And the person had AIDS?" "Yes." Camera said nothing for a moment. Then she spoke again. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Camera. I'm sure. That's how I got it." Her eyes remained open for a moment or two, and then she faded to sleep. On July 25th, 1979, in the picturesque Austrian hill town of Kitzbühel, I played the last tennis match of my professional career, and also one of the last tennis matches of my life. At the time, I had no idea that it would be so important. I lost in only the second round of the tournament to a virtually unknown French player named Christophe Fries. Certainly I had recognized for some time that my career was winding down. The previous month, I had been ignominiously defeated in the first round at Wimbledon by Chris Catchell, another player of whom nobody but his family, his friends, and a few local fans had ever heard. And this early Wimbledon exit repeated what had happened to me there the previous year. The end was clearly in sight. Nevertheless, I saw no reason why I couldn't continue to play professionally, with mixed success to be sure, for at least 2 or 3 more years. Less than a week after losing to Fries, I was in bed in New York, asleep before midnight, when I was jolted awake by the most intense chest pain I had ever suffered. After about 2 minutes, the pain subsided. Telling myself that I was suffering from nothing more than a severe case of indigestion, I tried to go back to sleep. I was almost there when the pain returned even more intensely than before. Breathing hard, I sat up in bed. I could not remember an attack of indigestion so acute. Again, the pain subsided. Again, I relaxed. And again, after about 15 minutes, I was jolted by an excruciating pressure in my chest. Finally, the pain ebbed, and I returned to sleep. The next day, August 1st, I was conducting a tennis clinic just across the East River from Manhattan when the pain struck again. This time it was far more intense and gave no sign of abating. A physician, Dr. Lee Wallace, who happened to be playing on a court nearby, asked me a few urgent questions. Then he insisted on escorting me personally to New York Hospital. Since then, I have come to know that institution well. "I want Mr. Ashe admitted as a possible heart attack patient," he informed a resident physician. This was my first indication that the pain I was suffering was the result of a heart attack. At New York Hospital, I spent 2 days in the intensive care unit and most of the following 8 days in the coronary care section. When I was released, I still hoped to resume my professional career. I missed the travel to foreign lands, the camaraderie of the players, the excitement of the matches themselves, and the prize money. In 1968, as an amateur, I had received exactly $280 in expense money after winning my country's most prestigious tournament, the first United States Open. 11 years later, the stakes were much higher, and we were all professionals now. Most of all, though, I missed the camaraderie and the competition. In spite of my heart problem, and although my game was not what it once was, I still hoped to serve and volley a few more times against the mightiest names in professional tennis: Borg, Nastase, Vilas, Newcomb, McEnroe, and Connors. Sorry, Arthur. Unless you have an operation, you can forget about playing tennis again. Certainly not professional tennis. 2 physicians, Dr. Mike Collins and Dr. Virginia Bouchard Smith, had scrutinized the result of a catheter examination of my arteries and heart and had laid down the law. Unless I underwent surgery, I could probably no longer think about playing tennis at the professional level. Perhaps I would not be able to play any tennis at all. I had enjoyed a wonderful career and didn't want it to end. I'd never been the most dominant player the game had ever seen or the most skilled. For example, my record against Rod Laver, who some experts call the greatest tennis player ever, is something I would rather not discuss, except to say that it's just about all in Laver's favor. But I had certainly had my moments of triumph. I had been top-ranked in the world once in my career and co-holder of the #1 position at another time. I had won 3 of the 4 Grand Slam tournaments that constitute the pillars of international professional tennis: the United States Open, the Australian Open, and Wimbledon. I had shared the doubles crown in the 4th Grand Slam event, the French Open, and also won with Tony Roach of Australia the Australian Open doubles crown. In the decade since 1968, the start of the Open era of professional tennis, I had played steadily and won 33 events. That is quite a good record. Perhaps I was even more pleased by the way I had played than by my results in terms of wins or losses, or even in terms of prize money. I had done nothing through scandal or bad behavior to bring the game into disrepute, and I was also proud that fans and other players had found my game adventurous. As a junior player, I'd been a pusher, mainly keeping the ball in play from the back of the court. Then in my senior year in high school in St. Louis, Missouri, I had turned myself into a serve and volley player. I became adventurous, sometimes even reckless. I liked being reckless, as long as I was reckless only on the tennis court, and as long as I won. Fans deserve to see a player with flair, someone for whom tennis is an art as well as a craft. Because I became bored fairly easily, I would try the difficult shot, or sometimes even the impossible shot, just for the hell of it. I was known for being a winning but frequently erratic player, or liberal, as the proudly conservative Clark Grabner once termed it in a genteel disparagement of my approach. I admit that I was capable of following flights of exhilarating tennis with bonehead misses. From time to time, my mind certainly wandered on the court. On the whole, however, I was entertaining, and I liked that. Because I did not want my career to end in 1979, on December 13th of that year I underwent a quadruple coronary bypass operation. With long, skillful incisions, my surgeon, Dr. John Hutchinson, removed veins from my legs and implanted them in my chest to take over the functions of my clogged arteries. He pronounced the operation a success. If he could not assure me that I would be playing tennis professionally again, he nevertheless gave me hope that my life might be pretty close to normal. Then, on March 9th, 1980, I discovered that my life would never again be perfectly normal. That afternoon in Cairo, during a long-anticipated visit, I left my hotel near the pyramids for what I hoped would be a pleasant run. 3 months had passed since I had undergone open heart surgery. As far as I was concerned, I was completely recovered and only weeks away from a return to professional tennis. I was loping along gently, easing into the main phase of my run, when the angina struck. It hit me relatively softly, but hard enough to stop me dead in my tracks. I felt the world come to a stop. I walked, slowly, back to the hotel. "Back already, Arthur?" Jean asked, half asleep from a nap. "What happened?" She was cool as could be, but I could tell she knew something was wrong. "Just a touch of angina. I thought I shouldn't go on with the run. Let's call Doug." Douglas Stein, a physician and one of our closest friends, had accompanied us on the trip. When Doug came, he took my pulse and listened to my heart. Then he asked me to try some exercises, jumping jacks. As soon as I started, the angina returned. He checked my pulse again and listened to my heart. "You were right to stop running," Doug said. "Your heart wants no part of it." "Should I be getting back to New York?" "I think that's a good idea, Arthur." "I'm sorry." "There's nothing to be sorry about," Doug responded. "If your heart is acting up, you should definitely be close to your cardiologist and your surgeon. At the very least, you should be close to top-class medical facilities where you would be recognized and taken care of at once. There are fine doctors here in Cairo, but we really don't know anyone. I don't think that this is an emergency, but there is no point in taking chances." As we flew out of Cairo, I knew one thing for sure. My career as a competitive tennis player was over. One life had ended, and another had not yet quite begun. For some years I had known this moment would come, but now it was here, in earnest. I had to negotiate the middle passage between the old and the new. Quite consciously, I gave myself a period of about 3 months simply to think about the past and about the future. At this crucial point in my life, I did not want to make any major mistakes. Looking back on that period, I see only one thing clearly, that it seemed to me quite possibly an impending crisis. I felt a subtle but pervasive dissatisfaction with my life up to that point, and a deep confusion about what the rest of my life would and should look like. How could I be dissatisfied, even subtly, with my life to that point? I had lived, many people would say, a fantasy of a life. I had won a measure of international fame many people would die for. I had traveled all over the world and often in grand style. Relatively speaking, I had made a great deal of money. I had won a large number of friends. How could I be dissatisfied? But I was dissatisfied. Who knows what force gnaws at us, telling us that our accomplishments, no matter how sensational, are not enough, that we need to do more. Some psychologists and some poets talk about the rage for immortality that operates like a dynamo in the hearts and minds of men and women despite all we know about the transience of glory and the inevitability of death. I don't think I wanted to be immortal, not in any literal sense. Although I enjoy receiving honors and awards, I am not obsessed by the question of whether or not people would know my name 100 years from now. But I did want to achieve something more than I had accomplished on the tennis court. For one thing, I had been a professional athlete, and as far as I was concerned, few people took professional athletes seriously. At that time, perhaps it is somewhat different now, I thought that professional athletes were the modern counterpart to minstrels or jongleurs in the Middle Ages. All we needed, I sometimes believed, was the pointed hats and the curved shoes tipped with little balls to be complete fools. From start to finish, we were entertainers, with essentially clownish roles assigned to us, for which we were handsomely paid. But the lavishness of the payment did not change the nature of our role. I wanted to be taken seriously. In part, I had been instructed by the efforts of other athletes who had begun to tear themselves out of the clown's costume in my own time. From the social and racial remove of the almost entirely white upper-class stratum that is the tennis world, I had looked with fascination on athletes who had stood up defiantly and protested against social injustice. Cautious about getting involved in politics and protest myself, I couldn't help but admire impetuous men such as Muhammad Ali, who struck me as menacing and purposeful even when he was amusing, a charming man but also unmistakably defiant. Or the somber black-gloved athlete protesters Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who turned the victory stand at the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968 into a sacrificial altar as they surrendered their victory to the greater good of downtrodden black people. Or more scholarly but in some ways equally militant protesters such as Dr. Harry Edwards of the University of California at Berkeley. Although I did not always agree with everything these men had said and done, I respected the way they had stood tall against the sky and had insisted on being heard on matters other than boxing or track and field, on weighty matters of civil rights and social responsibility and the destiny of black Americans in the modern world. For many years, even as I built my career in tennis, I had guiltily nursed the suspicion that I had not done as much as I should have in the arena of protest and politics, civil rights, and social reform. On the other hand, another part of me did not need a cue from other athletes, no matter how militant, about my duties as a citizen. I had been brought up to think that I myself was obliged to be a leader, and especially to help my fellow blacks. After years of caution, and with my tennis career over, I needed now to respond to those imperatives. I was adamant about not giving myself over exclusively to making money. If God hadn't put me on earth mainly to stroke tennis balls, He certainly hadn't put me here to be greedy. I wanted to make a difference, however small in the world, and I wanted to do so in a useful and honorable way. Quietly, for the most part. Jean had been listening to me talk about my anxieties concerning this stage of my life as it approached. She had been listening and watching me and anticipating my feelings through the many signals of distress I was obviously sending out, even if I was not fully aware of all or even most of them. Marrying Jean Marie Mutusimi had turned out to be a far wiser and more self-interested act than I had ever thought it might be. I had met her one day in New York City, at a benefit for the United Negro College Fund at the Felt Forum at Madison Square Garden. A graphic artist at NBC TV and a professional photographer, Jean was at the benefit on a press pass to take photographs. She took several pictures of me that day. I took a mental picture of her as maybe, just maybe, what my heart desired. I said hello to her, and we chatted. That was on October 16th, 1976. On February 20th, 1977, we were married. The night before, we visited Andrew Young and his wife, Jean, in their suite at the Waldorf Astoria where they lived. Andrew was then United States Ambassador to the United Nations. He was also an ordained minister, and he was going to marry us. He and his wife had asked us to come by so they could talk to us about marriage as a sacrament. That night, Andrew told us about the 6 people who were to be married by him the next day. 6 people, I asked, a little puzzled. You are marrying 6 people tomorrow? Yes and no, Andy replied. You see, when you and Jean get married tomorrow, 6 people will be involved. With each of you, there are really 3 persons. First, there is the person you are. Next, there is the person you think you are. Then there is the person others think you are. This is true of all marriages, not just yours. And in every marriage, all of these 6 people have to get along with one another if the contract is going to work. Jean and I were married with me standing on crutches, a symbol of physical frailty and vulnerability, recovering from an operation 10 days before to remove bone chips from my left heel. Little did Jean or I realize that those crutches were a portent of other maladies to come. She and I would be united in holy matrimony, but we would also be bound by a shared ordeal involving doctors and medicine, pain and suffering, and the threat of death at any time. Medical problems have dominated our marriage. These illnesses have bound us in a way that good fortune could not have. But binding or not, they have also created their own tensions. In the various episodes of my illnesses, many people called to ask how I was doing. A few people, not many, asked Jean, "How are you doing?" I can read in the newspapers how Arthur is doing, but what about you? She is grateful for all the calls, but she remembers those few people with a special gratitude, and I do too. My love for Jean has grown deeper with every passing year. It has become deeper with every medical crisis. My emotional attachment to her has become tighter. So too, at least in some cases, has my emotional dependence. I started to lean on her, to let myself depend on her. It took me a while to realize this fact, because I had taken pride for so long in being self-sufficient. But too much happened, and no sense of self-sufficiency could prevent me from realizing that, in many ways, life would be difficult without her. I think about certain situations in the past, then try to take Jean out of the equation, so to speak, and I wonder how I would have survived without her. The disappointments we shared could have driven us apart. Instead, they have brought us closer together. We will be together till death do us part. The fact that Jean and I had a history of heart disease in both our families naturally made us tense and intimidated when we thought about having children. How could we justify bringing a child into the world knowing that he or she most likely would be born with a predisposition to death at an early age? For a while, we assumed that we would not have any. That seemed the best way to proceed, no matter how much we regretted not experiencing the joys of parenthood. Around 1984, however, we decided that we wanted and needed a child. Steadily, the thought became more and more important to us. On December 21st, 1986, Camera came into our lives. We pulled out a bureau drawer and a walk-in closet, and that's where she slept her first night home. Like many first-time parents, we were obsessed by the possibility of sudden infant death, also called crib death, or another mysterious ailment that would take away from us the fragile little body that represented our hopes and dreams of the past few years. We kept popping up in bed and going over to the bureau drawer to make sure that she was well, to make sure, I think, that she was still there. Of course, the next morning she was alive and well, and she has been well ever since. I think if Jean and I prayed for anything in connection with our new baby, it was that he or she be healthy. Whether it be a boy or a girl didn't matter. Typically, whenever the pediatrician examines Camera and throws up his hands in mock exasperation and exclaims, "This is one healthy child," we thank God. From the first day, she altered the patterns of our lives. We knew that her coming would do so, but the extent to which she changed things was nevertheless something of a shock. In fact, our lives revolve around Camera. I do not take her or her health for granted. Children seem immortal, but I know how quickly they can be taken away. Like many well-known athletes, I have been to my share of children's hospitals trying to cheer up sick kids. Often you meet kids who are going to be well, but just as often you meet kids who you know are going to die soon. It is heartbreaking. I have experienced some sad days in my life, but few as harrowing as the day in Westport, Connecticut, only a few years ago when I was a pallbearer at the funeral of Alex DeFord, the daughter of my good friend Frank DeFord. Alex died of cystic fibrosis at the age of 8. So I take nothing about Camera for granted. I guess by now I take nothing about anything for granted. Few things have worked out exactly as I thought they would, and my life has taken curious turns. This is my middle passage, but because of my illnesses I have to face the fact that it is both a middle passage and possibly a terminus. I can't avoid the fact that AIDS is a terminal disease. No doubt science will one day come up with a vaccine or even a way to reverse the effects of AIDS itself in the human body. But that will be a cure for other people. Too late for me. Meanwhile, I keep sailing on in this middle passage. I am sailing into the wind and the dark, but I'm doing my best to keep my boat steady and my sails full. Ever since one fateful afternoon in 1950 or 1951, tennis has been at or near the center of my life. On that day, when I was 7, I had spent the greater part of an hour quietly watching Ron Charity, the most accomplished black tennis player in Richmond, practiced his serve alone on one of the tennis courts my father supervised at the 18-acre playground at Brookfield, where we lived. At some point, Charity stopped his practice. Walking over to me, he gently asked, "Would you like to learn to play?" "Yes, I would," I replied. As casually as that, my life was transformed. Diligently over the next year or two, Charity laid the foundation on which I built my career through the junior ranks, then as a college player and an adult amateur, then finally as a full-fledged professional. Now, 30 years later, as I retired from the circuit under strict orders from my doctors, I knew that tennis, above all, could provide the sturdiest bridge from my old life to the new. If I could no longer play the game, I could certainly teach it. In my capacity as director of tennis at the Doral Resort and Country Club in Florida, I would continue to do so. But I also knew that my richest reward would come from my continued involvement in the Davis Cup campaigns, where teams represented their country in the most distinguished international competition in tennis. Once Charity's lessons and a love of the game had taken hold of me in Richmond, 3 stars shone brighter than all the others in my sky. One of them was Pancho Gonzalez, who was not only the best player in the world but also an outsider like me, because he was a Mexican-American. The second was the West Side Tennis Club in Forest Hills, New York, sacred ground to me because it was the home of our national tennis championships. The third star, at least as bright as the others, was the Davis Cup, the international competition in which one day, with luck, I might be allowed to play for my country. The original 13-inch silver cup was named for Dwight F. Davis, an American who donated it in 1900 both to stimulate international competition and to promote goodwill. Segregation and racism had made me loathe aspects of the white South, but had left me scarcely less of a patriot. In fact, to me and my family, winning a place on our national team would mark my ultimate triumph over all those people who had opposed my career in the South in the name of segregation. As a junior in Richmond, I was barred from playing on most of the public tennis courts, which were reserved for whites, and the most powerful local tennis officials had tried to kill my game by shutting me out of any competition involving whites. But my game hadn't died, because other people had given me the chance to grow. Finally, in 1963, I was 20 years old and a sophomore at UCLA. Bob Kellerer, then the U.S. Davis Cup captain, invited me to join the team. Even as race relations in America became increasingly stormy, and I started to feel the attraction of more militant approaches to segregation and racism, I nevertheless saw my Davis Cup appointment as the outstanding honor of my life to that point. Since no black American had ever been on the team, I was now a part of history. Despite segregation, I loved the United States. That year, I played only one Davis Cup match, a dead rubber match, one played after the best-of-5 series has been decided, in which I defeated Orlando Bracamonte of Venezuela. And at the moment of my victory, it thrilled me, beyond measure, to hear the umpire announce not my name, but that of my country. Game, United States. Set, United States. Game, set, and match, United States. Over the next 15 years, I played 32 Davis Cup matches and won 27 of them, more than any American in the history of the Cup to that point. I had some stirring victories, but so demanding is Davis Cup play that I remember most clearly my losses, especially 2 singles defeats against Brazil and Ecuador in 1967. I remember them vividly because they were national as well as personal defeats, and thus hurt me more. I played my last Davis Cup match in 1978. To my surprise, the opportunity to lead the team came sooner than I had expected. Indeed, the very year I retired. Between 1980 and 1985, I served as captain of the United States team. Although other involvements marked that period of my life, my captaincy was its highlight. My captaincy also proved to be much more challenging than I had anticipated. Those 5 years turned out to be, on the whole, a disorganized, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes frustrating, and even humiliating epic of victories and defeats, excitement and tedium, camaraderie and isolation. At a mature age, I learned a fair amount about my strengths and my weaknesses, my principles and my moods. I also learned much about other people, including the 2 finest players in the world, Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe, and a generous selection of other memorable personalities who then made up the elite of men's international tennis competition. I learned about the sharp differences between individualism and leadership, playing and coaching, the younger generation and the old guard of which I was rapidly becoming a member. In my middle passage, nothing shoved me along so rudely into the future as my experience as a captain in the Davis Cup Wars. As I had hoped, my captaincy in the Davis Cup proved to be a bridge, albeit one with some broken planks, and one that sometimes swayed ominously in the wind between my glory years as a player and the obscurity of my retirement. The cup kept me in the public eye and in the sports pages much longer than I otherwise would have been. This exposure probably also brought me a few endorsements and other financial opportunities that I would not otherwise have earned. However, my cup captaincy did not fully satisfy my desire to make the most of my retirement years, or give me an entirely settled perspective on my new life. In the first place, I had been less than triumphant as a leader after my initial successes. More important, even the most impressive record in tennis would not have stilled certain disquieting feelings that ran deeper in me than patriotism or sporting fame. I am an African American, one born in the iron grip of legal segregation. Aside from my feeling about religion and family, my innermost stirrings inevitably have to do with trying to overcome racism and other forms of social injustice, with the search for dignity and power for blacks in a world so often hostile to us. Not the tennis court, but the arena of protest and politics would be the single most significant testing ground for me in the middle years of my life. A day or so after the announcement that I had resigned from the Davis Cup captaincy, I received a telephone call from the sports editor of Jet magazine. Jet, a sister publication of the better-known Ebony, is a lively little magazine of news about the African-American world. Like most journals and newspapers devoted to black Americans, it examines most developments with a focus on race and politics. Arthur, the editor began, according to various reports, including the New York Times, you didn't want to give up the captaincy. Is that true? I think it's fair to say that. No, I did not want to give up the captaincy. No one wants to go out on a losing note. You were forced out. Yes, I was forced out, I suppose, I answered, although it certainly was done according to law. Do you think that politics had anything to do with it? What do you mean by politics? I asked. I mean your interest in human rights. For example, your ongoing opposition to the practice of apartheid in South Africa. I thought about the question, but only for a moment. I did not want to misrepresent the situation and embarrass the United States Tennis Association, but I also did not want to avoid telling the truth. I think so, I answered. I believe that my role in publicly protesting against apartheid probably had something to do with the USTA deciding not to ask me back for next year. Some people probably think I've gone too far. Did the president tell you that? No, he didn't. No one at the USTA said so to my face. But I've heard so from other sources. Could you tell us about these sources? What did they say? No, I replied. I can't tell you about them or what they said. I was given certain information on a confidential basis, and I can't reveal anything more. Besides, I don't believe that politics was the only reason, so I don't want to make too much of what I was told. The story duly appeared, headlined, Ashe says activist role may be part of his ouster as Davis Cup team captain. Happily, it was accurate and fair. I certainly did not want to exploit the situation and make Randy Gregson and the USTA appear to be villains in a political drama. However, I sincerely believe that Gregson and others in the USTA saw me as someone far more concerned with politics than a Davis Cup captain should be. And by politics, I'm sure they meant radical politics. I was then, and am now, no radical. But many people in the tennis leadership, as in other sports, are terrified of taking a stand on political affairs or on controversial questions of social justice. Although certain exceptions come to mind, the prevailing political ambience of tennis has always been a wealth-oriented conservatism of the kind associated in this country with staunch republicanism and exclusive country clubs. The idea of apartheid in South Africa undoubtedly is abhorrent to some of these people, but the idea of demonstrating in the streets against it might be even more abhorrent in practical terms. I respect many of the values of conservatism and republicanism, but I hate apartheid much more than I love decorum. The previous January, I had been arrested in Washington, D.C. while taking part in a demonstration against South Africa. Quietly, innocently, South Africa had come into my life on an exquisite June afternoon in 1968 at the Queen's Club in London. For 40 years or more, and until recently, the Queen's Club tournament was notable among tennis lovers mainly as the last competition for top players in Britain before Wimbledon. Queen's offered the last chance to hone one's skills on grass courts before participating in the premier tournament in the world. In the clubhouse, I was sitting next to John Newcombe in a meeting with a group of top players all bound for Wimbledon. Only 2 months after the first Open tennis tournament, we were talking primarily about the possibility of forming an association of professional tennis players, a kind of trade union, and about the reception we would expect from various governing bodies around the world. The first Open Wimbledon was at hand. The first U.S. Open would be held later in the summer. One of the South African players, Cliff Drysdale, mentioned that the first South African Open would be held in the fall. He and his compatriots, top players like Fru McMillan and Ray Moore, were eagerly looking forward to the competition, which hoped to attract Estella Field to Johannesburg. Turning to me, Drysdale said casually, "They'd never let you play." I was startled. "Is it that bad?" "Oh, the Lawn Tennis Association would let you play," Cliff explained. "I'm pretty sure of that. In fact, they would love to have you come. But you would need a visa to enter South Africa, and the government would never let you have one." "Are you serious?" "Try them. You'll see." The following year, 1969, I mailed an application for a visa to allow me to play in the Open. My application was rejected. At that time, South Africa was not a major political issue for American voters, white or black, or indeed for many people outside South Africa itself. The United Nations had not yet voted to impose social and cultural isolation on the nation of apartheid. Portugal still held the territories of Mozambique and Angola, which served as effective buffers between South Africa and independent black Africa. South Africa still played in the Davis Cup. In fact, it would win the cup in 1974 when India defaulted in the final rather than compete in sport with South Africa. The bloody Soweto student uprising of June 16, 1976, which transformed the image of South Africa for many people, and which I learned about several weeks later while I was at Wimbledon, had not yet taken place. I tried again for a visa in 1970 and was rebuffed again. Finally, in 1973, I was allowed in. I visited South Africa again in 1974, 1975, and 1977. On each occasion, except for 1977 when I was there on assignment for ABC Sports, I insisted that there be no segregated seating at my matches, and my request was honored. In 1973, my appearance there in the Open created a sensation, especially when I proceeded to do well on the court. I made my way to the men's singles final before losing to Jimmy Connors and won the doubles title with Tom Acker. Tennis, however, was only one aspect of my visits. I was eager to learn as much as I could about the condition of people there, especially the non-white peoples held in bondage by apartheid. And there was no shortage of people, white, black, colored, or Indian, just as eager to share with me their lifelong experience of apartheid and their vision of the future of South Africa. I looked apartheid directly in the face, saw the appalling whites-only and non-whites-only signs, the separate and drastically unequal facilities very much like those of my childhood in Virginia. I saw the sneer of superiority on the faces of many whites and the look of obsequiousness, fatalism, cynicism, and despair on the faces of many blacks. I saw the rigid divisions between the black and colored and Asian and Jewish and English and Dutch peoples, with the Dutch holding the highest ground of apartheid. I met educated, kindly, but dedicated apologists for apartheid. I met liberal whites troubled by the system that sustained their privilege. And I even stayed in the home of one of them, a Jewish businessman. I was also befriended by Indians, coloreds, and blacks. I will never forget one black boy, about 14 years old, who in 1974 seemed to follow me around Johannesburg's Ellis Park, the most hallowed site in South African rugby, the national sport, and the site also of the South African Open. Every day, he was there when I arrived, and he seemed to be there when I left. He was watchful but shy as he shadowed me around the park. It was as if I exuded some precious, mysterious quality that he wanted to possess. Finally, I confronted him, though gently. "Tell me something," I said. "Why are you following me around?" "Because you are the first one I have ever seen," he answered. "The first what?" "You are the first truly free black man I have ever seen." When I heard these words, I felt a distinct chill. Nothing anyone else said or wrote during my stay captured as poignantly for me the abyss of inhumanity that was South African apartheid. In my adamant opposition to apartheid, I felt it first in the early 1970s as one among only a handful of people in the black American community. But other people were starting to fight this potent vestige of white supremacy in Africa. Almost from its inception, I was involved in Trans-Africa, the organization set up by the Black Congressional Caucus as a sort of think tank and lobby for African and Caribbean affairs, the first and still the only think tank controlled by black Americans and with a focus on foreign affairs. Its first executive director was Arnold Rampersad, a childhood friend of mine from Richmond. For several summers as boys, Randall and I had played baseball together. His father had been the leading coach and sports administrator in the black community, and a fixture at Brookfield, where I lived. Randall went on to graduate from Virginia Union in Richmond, and then from Harvard Law School. As adults, we worked closely on developing Trans-Africa Forum, which raises tax-exempt money for Trans-Africa. I have served for many years as co-chair of the forum. In addition, I became a founding member of Artists and Athletes Against Apartheid, which I co-chaired with Harry Belafonte. One of our main goals as we stepped up our pressure on South Africa was to persuade athletes and entertainers not to perform there. I had gone to South Africa to play tennis before United Nations sanctions against the nation were in place. Now, we worked to enforce those sanctions. On January 11, 1985, I was arrested outside the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C. Although this was not a particularly risky act, I nevertheless found it disturbing. Because I had spent my life making sure no one would ever have cause to arrest me for anything, the experience of being handcuffed, carted away, and booked was daunting. I also knew that in certain circles my arrest could cost me some influence and prestige. Very few professional athletes, let alone captains of national sporting teams, are arrested for taking part in political demonstrations. The cause itself seemed not to matter. By 1985, I was at last satisfied that the anti-apartheid movement, once exotic, was blossoming in America. Arrested along with me that January 11 were 16 other demonstrators, including teachers, municipal workers, and trade union officials. And we were only one small part of an ongoing national effort since November of the previous year, when 3 prominent blacks had staged a sit-in at the South African Embassy in Washington. Behind the national effort was the Free South Africa movement, coordinated by Arnold Rampersad, who had been one of the 3 people in that sit-in. Since November, a host of well-known figures, including Belafonte, Coretta Scott King, and myself, had walked the picket lines outside the embassy complex. The picketing continued long after my arrest, with demonstrations and arrests taking place in other cities. When Jesse Jackson was arrested in March, the police had charged almost 1,500 people in Washington alone. By August, 3,000 had been arrested. The core of my opposition to apartheid was undoubtedly my memory of growing up under segregation in Virginia. The whites-only signs in Johannesburg shocked me back to the days when I could play in Brookfield Park with other blacks, or with a visiting white player looking for a good game, but not in the many better-equipped public courts reserved for whites. It reminded me of going with Ron Charity, who had taught me to play tennis, to try to convince Sam Woods, the white man who practically ran tennis in Richmond, to allow me to play in a city tournament. Charity asked respectfully on my behalf, but Woods, a kindly, gracious, gray-haired man, said no. I was 12 years old. After my arrest, I told the Washington Post, in explaining my opposition to apartheid, I speak with a great deal of personal experience. I went through a segregated school system and a segregated society. I had also gone through that school system and the society that sponsored it without a protest. Blacks did not publicly protest much in Virginia when I was growing up, and they protested even less in my father's household. If I had left the matter to my father, I probably would not have been arrested in 1985. Before going on the picket line in January, I had telephoned him in Richmond. "Daddy, I want you to know that I'm probably going to be arrested tomorrow in Washington." He paused before answering. When he spoke, I could hear a nervousness in his voice. "In Washington? Is this about that South Africa business, Arthur?" "Yes, Dad." "Well, son, I don't know. South Africa's an awful long way from us here. But if you think you have to do it, then I guess you have to do it." "I have to do it, Dad." "All right, son. Just be careful." "Yes, Daddy. I'll be careful." And I was. I was careful again when I received other requests to put my body on the line, even in this largely symbolic way against apartheid. Sometimes I acceded to the requests, but most often I did not. Much as I admire certain well-known entertainers who are quick to respond to calls to the barricades, I did not want to become a fashionable protester giving photo opportunities, as they are called, to celebrity-minded journalists. I also wrestled with a far more perplexing question. To what extent was I trying to make up, with my anti-apartheid crusade, for my relative inaction a decade or more earlier during the civil rights struggle? No one knew better than I that a demonstration such as the one in Washington, when I was arrested, was mainly a staged or token affair, a piece of political choreography. I did not feel in any way like a hero for taking part in it. Indeed, I was painfully aware of the difference between, on one hand, the symbolic punishment that I had allowed myself to be subjected to, and on the other hand, the terror that the Ku Klux Klan and thousands of white Southern vigilantes and law officers imposed on the black men, women, and children who risked their lives during the civil rights movement. While blood was running freely in the streets of Birmingham, Memphis, and Biloxi, I had been playing tennis. I certainly had been offered more than one opportunity to stand up for the movement. The black social revolution definitely reached UCLA, where I had gone to college. I remember one long conversation with the intense, argumentative but likable Ron Karenga, a cultural nationalist who was the head of an organization ingeniously called US, which stood for Us Slaves. A passionate man, Karenga was driven by the need for blacks to learn their own history and develop their own rites and rituals as part of the building of a black nation. He even invented Kwanzaa, a ritualistic celebration for blacks based on a crossing of African beliefs and rituals with beliefs and rituals from other parts of the world. Celebrated around Christmas time, Kwanzaa is obviously designed to rival or even supplant it, although some nationalists claim differently. Karenga was persuasive, and I listened with genuine respect. But I was never able to cross the wall that separated athletes with scholarships to UCLA from the other students. Besides, there was an irrational edge to us slaves, as there is perhaps in all extreme cultural nationalism. In conflicts with the Black Panthers, 2 US members were killed at UCLA about this time, and the organization never recovered. Those killings did nothing to ease my misgivings about militant politics. Some of my friends tried to assure me that I, too, was playing my part in the revolution, but they never convinced me of it, not completely. There were times, in fact, when I felt a burning sense of shame that I was not with other blacks and whites, standing up to the fire hoses and the police dogs, the truncheons, bullets, and bombs that cut down such martyrs as Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman, Viola Liuzzo, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, and the little girls in that bombed church in Birmingham, Alabama. As my fame increased, so did my anguish. I knew that many blacks were proud of my accomplishments on the tennis court. But I also knew that many others, especially many of my own age or younger, did not bother to hide their indifference to me and my trophies, or even their disdain and contempt for me. Should I have done more? It was hard for me to act when I could see that what some people wanted me to do would have clashed violently with the principles I had evolved for myself over the years, principles having to do with the love of peace, morality, moderation, and religion. My character was set in this way. I would not change for anybody. I will never forget something that Jesse Jackson said to me one evening in the 1970s in Atlanta. We were in the basement playroom of the home of Walt Hazzard, then an Atlanta Hawks basketball player, who had been a star at UCLA during my time there. Several other young blacks were in the room, in addition to Jackson, Hazzard, Andrew Young, and myself. Donald Dell was the only white there. We were in the middle of a warm discussion of race, politics, and protest, and I was defending my principles or trying to explain them, when Jackson struck me with a sharp comment. "The problem with you, Arthur," he declared, "is that you're not arrogant enough. You're just not arrogant enough." "You're right, Jesse," I answered. "I'm not arrogant. But I don't think that my lack of arrogance lessens my effectiveness one bit. I really don't think so." I'd heard this complaint before, expressed in various ways. At best, the arrogance Jackson seemed to want in me was not a purely self-serving arrogance, but one that employed ego for some larger goal. The trouble, however, is that once empowered and turned loose, egotism and arrogance are hard to control. I'm not sure that Jesse in his own life has ever understood this lesson fully, despite the good work that he has done. As for myself, I found out a long time ago that I am best when I keep my ego under tight control and try to reason and look ahead beyond temporary, flashy victories at some other human being's expense to the future. One consequence of my commitment to reasoning and reconciling would always be to have some people think of me as conservative, or opportunistic, or even a coward. So be it. Needless to say, there were times when I asked myself whether I was being principled or simply a coward. While I was growing up, I was undoubtedly timid, away from the tennis court. I was not only my father's child, I was wrapped in the cocoon of tennis early in life, mainly by blacks like my most powerful mentor, Dr. Robert Walter Johnson of Lynchburg, Virginia. They insisted that I be unfailingly polite on the court, unfalteringly calm and detached, so that whites could never accuse me of meanness. I learned well. I looked at photographs of the skinny, frail little black boy that I was in the early 1950s, and I see that I was my tennis racket, and my tennis racket was me. It was my rod and my staff. Looking out for his two motherless sons, my father tried to keep us out of harm's way, and the possibility of harm was real. We all knew what had happened to Emmett Till, whose death in 1955 cast a shadow over my youth and that of virtually all black kids in Richmond, and no doubt across America. 14 years old and from Chicago, Emmett was visiting his family in Mississippi when, on a dare, according to the reports, he whistled at a white woman. White men came for him at his uncle's house, took him away, murdered him, mutilated his body, and dumped it in a river. We assumed that the Ku Klux Klan was to blame. Virginia was not Mississippi, but the Klan was with us, too. It could happen to any of us. With mounting excitement, I read the news as the 1980s drew to a close, that the famous winds of change in Africa announced by Britain's Prime Minister Harold Macmillan more than a generation before finally seemed to be blowing democracy into South Africa. Change was coming imperfectly, through the concessions and maneuverings of South Africa Prime Minister F.W. de Klerk in response to the pressures exerted on apartheid, but it was coming. I treasured the many letters and telephone calls that came to me from my friends there because they were often far more enlightening than the news reports. Although I refused to be cynical or pessimistic about the possibilities of social change, I also had to resist making too much of what those same winds had actually brought thus far to South Africa. Thus, in September 1989, at the United Nations Plaza Hotel in New York, I made a plea to the board of the Association of Tennis Professionals, which was on the verge of approving 2 tournaments in Johannesburg for the coming year, not to do so. Passionately at times, I stressed that the major black South African leader, Nelson Mandela, wanted the sports boycott maintained, that the organizers of the Olympic Games were skeptical about South African promises, and that the other sporting bodies were insisting on more telling signs of the demise of apartheid. To my intense satisfaction, the ATP board decided not to include the tournaments. Accompanying me on that mission, at my invitation, was Mark Mathabane. 15 years before, as a boy of 14 or so, he had followed me around Ellis Park in Johannesburg and stunned me with his remark that I had been the first truly free black man he had ever seen. Now, he himself was free, insofar as any of us is ever free, and the author of an acclaimed book, Kaffir Boy, about growing up in South Africa as well as other books. In Kaffir Boy, Mark wrote about what my example and my first visit to South Africa had meant to him. The more I read about the world of tennis, he recalled, and Arthur Ashe's role in it, the more I began to dream of its possibilities. What if I, too, were someday to attain the same fame and fortune as Arthur Ashe? Would whites respect me as they did him? Would I be as free as he? The dreams were tantalizing, but I knew they were only dreams. Nevertheless, I kept dreaming. After all, what harm could that do me? Finally, at Ellis Park, he saw me play. How could a black man play such excellent tennis, he wrote about my victory over a white opponent, move about the court with such self-confidence, trash a white man, and be cheered by white people? Eventually, with the help of Stan Smith and others, Mathabane came to the U.S. to attend college and find expression for his literary talents that easily might have been destroyed in South Africa. I thank God that I lived long enough to see Nelson Mandela come to the United States and be welcomed with a ticker-tape parade through the canyons of Wall Street in New York. I was seldom more proud of America and my fellow Americans than when I saw the way we welcomed him as a hero. The success of the parade was a sure and gratifying sign that many people, black and white, rich and poor, recognize his sacrifice and applaud the almost superhuman way he preserved his dignity, his humor, and his unquenchable moral sense through the nearly 3 decades of his imprisonment. He became one of my heroes long before I met him, so it was a special thrill when we first came together. I thank God that I lived long enough for one last visit to South Africa in November 1991, which I made in a delegation of African Americans invited by Mandela himself. To go to South Africa, I was compelled to lie on my application for a visa and declare that I did not have an infectious disease. I try never to lie, but I lied. And I had to see South Africa at least one more time, to talk directly to friends there and see some of the changes for myself. In many ways, Johannesburg, where we spent 3 days, had not changed much since 1977. But in at least 2 ways, it was drastically different. The apartheid signs, whites only, non-whites only, were gone, except in a few instances. And more astonishing, the black people seemed transformed. The old subservience and obsequiousness had vanished, and the same people now seemed self-assured and even fearless. They were ready for the future. All of us can learn from the example of Mandela. For African Americans, however, he may have a greater lesson. On the most basic level, that lesson is about the need to resist oppression. But his lesson is also something more complicated and challenging. Mandela's example leads us to ask certain questions on which I believe our future may depend. Can we African Americans emerge from the prison house of our history with true dignity as he did? That is, with the determination to remain free but without bitterness or any other compromise in our moral principles? Can we prevent our outrage at the wrongs we have suffered in America from destroying our spirit, from depriving us of the high moral ground we once held? Can we avoid the temptation to sink utterly into despair, cynicism, and violence, and thus become abject prisoners of our past? When I was a youngster growing up in Richmond, I could answer these questions boldly and in the affirmative, as our parents and teachers and elders had taught us we must do. Now I grope for a response, which is at least part of the reason I see race as a burden, a grave burden, one that outweighs all others in my life. I had spent more than an hour talking in my office at home with a reporter from People magazine. Her editor had sent her to do a story about me and how I was coping with AIDS. The reporter's questions had been probing and yet respectful of my right to privacy. Now, our interview over, I was escorting her to the door. As she slipped on her coat, she fell silent. I could see that she was groping for the right words to express her sympathy for me before she left. "Mr. Ashe, I guess this must be the heaviest burden you have ever had to bear, isn't it?" she asked finally. I thought for a moment, but only a moment. "No, it isn't. It's a burden, all right. But AIDS isn't the heaviest burden I have had to bear. Is there something worse? Your heart attack? I didn't want to detain her, but I let the door close with both of us still inside. You're not going to believe this, I said to her, but being black is the greatest burden I've had to bear. You can't mean that. No question about it. Race has always been my biggest burden, having to live as a minority in America. Even now, it continues to feel like an extra weight tied around me. I can still recall the surprise and perhaps even the hurt on her face. I may have even surprised myself, because I simply had never thought of comparing the two conditions before. However, I stand by my remark. Race is for me a more onerous burden than AIDS. My disease is the result of biological factors over which we, thus far, have had no control. Racism, however, is entirely made by people, and therefore it hurts and inconveniences infinitely more. Since our interview, skillfully presented as a first-person account by me, appeared in People in June 1992, many people have commented on my remark. A radio station in Chicago aimed primarily at blacks conducted a lively debate of its merits on the air. Most African Americans have little trouble understanding and accepting my statement, but other people have been baffled by it. Some people have asked me flatly, what could you, Arthur Ashe, possibly have to complain about? Do you want more money or fame than you already have? Isn't AIDS inevitably fatal? What can be worse than death? The novelist Henry James suggested somewhere that it is a complex fate being an American. I think it is a far more complex fate being an African American. I also sometimes think that this indeed may be one of those fates that are worse than death. I do not want to be misunderstood. I do not mean to appear fatalistic, self-pitying, cynical, or maudlin. Proud to be an American, I am also proud to be an African American. I delight in the accomplishments of fellow citizens of my color. When one considers the odds against which we have labored, we have achieved much. I believe in life and hope and love, and I turn my back on death unless I must face death in all its finality. I'm an optimist, not a pessimist. Still, a pall of sadness hangs over my life and the lives of almost all African Americans because of what we, as a people, have experienced historically in America, and what we as individuals experience each and every day. Whether one is a welfare recipient trapped in some blighted housing project in the inner city, or a former Wimbledon champion who is easily recognized on the streets and whose home is a luxurious apartment in one of the wealthiest districts of Manhattan, the sadness is still there. In some respects, I am a prisoner of the past. A long time ago, I made peace with the state of Virginia and the South. While I, like other blacks, was once barred from free association with whites, I returned time and time again under the new rule of desegregation to work with whites in my hometown and across the South. But segregation had achieved by that time what it was intended to achieve. It left me a marked man, forever aware of a shadow of contempt that lays across my identity and my sense of self-esteem. Subtly, the shadow falls on my reputation. The way I know I am perceived, the mere memory of it darkens my most sunny days. I believe the same is true for almost every African American of the slightest sensitivity and intelligence. The shadow fell across me recently on one of the brightest days, literally and metaphorically, of my life. On August 30th, 1992, the day before the U.S. Open, the USTA and I together hosted an afternoon of tennis at the National Tennis Center in Flushing Meadows, New York. The event was a benefit for the Arthur Ashe Foundation for the Defeat of AIDS. Before the start, I was nervous. Would the invited stars, McEnroe, Graf, Navratilova, and all the others, show up? Would they cooperate with us or be difficult to manage? And on the eve of a Grand Slam tournament, would fans pay to see light-hearted tennis? The answers were all a resounding yes. Just over 10,000 fans turned out. With CBS televising the event live and Aetna having provided the airtime, a profit was assured. The sun shone brightly, the humidity was mild, and the temperature hovered in the low 80s. What could mar such a day? The shadow of race, and my sensitivity, or perhaps hypersensitivity, to its nuances. Sharing the main stadium box with Jean, Camera, and me at my invitation were Stan Smith, his wife Marjorie, and their daughter Logan. The two little girls were happy to see one another. During Wimbledon in June, they had renewed that friendship when we all stayed near each other in London. Now Logan, aged 7 years old, had brought Camera a present. She had come with twin dolls, one for herself, one for Camera. A thoughtful gesture on Logan's part, and on her parents' part, no doubt. The Smiths are fine, religious people. Then I noticed that Camera was playing with her doll above the railing of the box in full view of the attentive network television cameras. The doll was the problem, or rather, the fact that the doll was conspicuously a blonde. Camera owns dolls of all colors, nationalities, and ethnic varieties, but she was now on national television playing with a blonde doll. Suddenly I heard voices in my head, the voices of irate listeners to a call-in show on some black-format radio station. I imagined insistent, clamorous callers attacking Camera, Jean, and me. Can you believe the doll Arthur Ashe's daughter was holding up at the AIDS benefit? Wasn't that a shame? Is that brother sick or what? Somebody ought to teach that poor child about her true black self. What kind of role model is Arthur Ashe if he allows his daughter to be brainwashed in that way? Doesn't the brother understand that he is corrupting his child's mind with notions about the superiority of the white woman? I tell you, I thought we were long past that. The voices became louder in my head. Despite the low humidity, I began to squirm in my seat. What should I do? Should I say, to hell with what some people might think? I know that Camera likes her blonde dolls, black dolls, brown dolls, Asian dolls, Indian dolls, just about equally. I know that for a fact because I've watched her closely. I have searched for signs of racial partiality in her, indications that she may be dissatisfied with herself, with her own color. I have seen none. But I cannot dismiss the voices. I try always to live practically, and I do not wish to hear such comments on the radio. On the other hand, I do not want Logan's gift to be sullied by an ungracious response. Finally, I act. Jean, I whisper, we have to do something. About what? She whispers back. That doll. We have to get Camera to put that doll down. Jean takes one look at Camera and the doll, and she understands immediately. Quietly, cleverly, she makes the dolls disappear. Neither Camera nor Logan is aware of anything unusual happening. Smoothly, Jean has moved them on to some other distraction. I am unaware if Margie Smith has noticed us, but I believe I owe her an explanation. I get up and go around to her seat. Softly, I tell her why the dolls have disappeared. Margie is startled, dumbfounded. Gosh, Arthur, I never thought about that. I never, ever thought about anything like that. You don't have to think about it, I explained. But it happens to us in similar situations all the time. All the time? She is pensive now. All the time. It's perfectly understandable, and it certainly is not your fault. You are doing what comes naturally. But for us, the dolls make for a bit of a problem. All for the wrong reasons. It shouldn't be this way, but it is. I return to my seat, but not to the elation I had felt before I saw the blonde doll in Camera's hand. I feel myself becoming more and more angry. I am angry at the force that made me act, the force of racism in all its complexity, as it spreads into the world and creates defensiveness and intolerance among the very people harmed by racism. I am also angry with myself. I am angry with myself because I have just acted out of pure practicality, not out of morality. The moral act would have been to let Camera have her fun, because she was innocent of any wrongdoing. Instead, I had tampered with her innocence, her basic human right to act impulsively, to accept a gift from a friend in the same beautiful spirit in which it was given. Deeply embarrassed now, I am ashamed at what I have done. I have made Camera adjust her behavior merely because of the likelihood that some people in the African American community would react to her innocence foolishly and perhaps even maliciously. I know I am not misreading the situation. I would have had telephone calls that very evening about the unsuitability of Camera's doll. Am I being a hypocrite? Yes, definitely, up to a point. I have allowed myself to give in to those people who say we must avoid even the slightest semblance of Eurocentric influence. But I also know what stands behind the entire situation. racism ultimately created the state in which defensiveness and hypocrisy are almost instinctive responses, and innocence and generosity are invitations to trouble. This incident almost ruined the day for me. That night when Jean and I talked about the excitement of the afternoon and the money that would go to AIDS research and education because of the event, we nevertheless ended up talking mostly about the incident of the dolls. We also talked about perhaps its most ironic aspect. In 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled against school segregation in Brown v. Board of Education, some of the most persuasive testimony came from the psychologist Dr. Kenneth Clark concerning his research on black children and their pathetic preference for white dolls over black. In 1992, the dolls are still a problem. Once again, the shadow of race had fallen on me. I am almost always aware of race, alert to its power as an idea, sensitive to its nuances in the world. Like many other blacks, when I find myself in a new public situation, I will count. I always count. I count the number of black and brown faces present, especially to see how many, if any, are employed by the hosts. For example, when I had a heart attack in 1992 after taking part in a demonstration against the U.S. policy concerning refugees fleeing Haiti, I was not too distressed to count the darker faces in the emergency room at New York Hospital, where I have often been. I saw some Filipino nurses and far fewer blacks. One black nurse sounded Haitian. I saw a black female resident in cardiology, a young doctor from Cornell Medical School. As might be expected, the floors were mainly cleaned by blacks. Two of the cleaners, both Haitian women, confided to me that they had heard about my participation in the demonstration, and that they appreciated what I had done. What I didn't tell them, but certainly thought, was that I would have been just as happy to do it if the people were Swedish rather than Haitian, if the Swedes were similarly oppressed. I am sure race had something to do with my decision to take part, but I would like to think that the dominating factor was that I saw an injustice being done and decided to do something, however small, about it. As a celebrity, I encounter few examples of overt racism directed specifically at me. Perhaps I encounter more than I acknowledge, because I never want to dignify ignorant or malicious people by assuming they are fully aware of what they do. I am well known because of my years as a tennis player and my exposure on television as a commentator, and few people try to humiliate a celebrity. Rarely, of course, I come across someone who takes a special pleasure in doing precisely that. I remember vividly, however, growing up under segregation. I remember the mandatory all-black schools and the white line behind which I had to ride on buses. I remember the kindly white bus driver who politely but firmly made me move to the back of the bus after I had sunk blissfully into the most cherished seat for a young boy, down front, right across from the driver. I remember the kindly white tennis official, Sam Wood, who would not allow me to play in municipal tournaments in Richmond, and all the other not-so-kind officials who barred my way so that I finally played in only one official tennis tournament while I was a junior in Virginia. I remember that the University of Virginia, the state school founded by Thomas Jefferson, was forbidden to me because of the color of my skin. In St. Louis, where I lived during my senior year in high school, I played freely with a cadre of brilliant white players about my age. But there were private clubs where they were welcome, but I was not, and one tennis court from which I was literally and ignominiously chased. I also sensed the limits of hospitality and friendship between me and most of the white boys I played with. Sipping a cold Coca-Cola after practice was fine, and an occasional visit to the home of one or another. Beyond that point, a wall rose between us to keep us apart. In Los Angeles, where I attended UCLA, the barrier against interracial dating fell, because an exclusive club called Balboa Bay still barred me from its grounds. And the mother of the first white girl I dared to date recoiled in horror when she saw me on television and discovered that I was black, a detail that her daughter had failed to mention in singing my praises. After I became better known following my selection for the Davis Cup team and my entry into the top 10 of American players, both in 1963, I faced racial discrimination less and less. By this time, too, I was on my way to becoming a master at the game that all African Americans must learn if they wish to preserve their sanity: how to live with reasonable freedom and dignity and yet also avoid insult, disappointment, and conflict rooted in racism. I learned not so much to turn the other cheek as to present, wherever possible, no cheek at all. I learned to give no opportunity for a bigot to pounce on and exploit. I learned in moments of humiliation to walk away with what was left of my dignity, rather than lose it all in an explosion of rage. I learned to raise my eyes to the high moral ground and to stake my future on it. I revered Martin Luther King Jr. because, on the question of race, no African American commanded that ground as splendidly as he did, with surpassing eloquence and, despite his human failings, consistency of argument. Although I ceased to experience racial discrimination on a daily basis, race remained a burden for me, the most oppressive burden of my life. In fact, race is a double burden. Coping with racism is onerous, but so is coping with the myriad effects of that racism on blacks in general. The ways in which the harsh conditions under which most of us live have led to patterns of behavior that are themselves destructive. And yet I am no tragic mulatto, caught poignantly or forlornly between the races, as are many coloreds in South Africa or mulattoes in the Caribbean. Any person, black or white, who refuses to surrender himself or herself to racism is bound to know that feeling intimately. One is on the margin or between two groups if one chooses to be rational rather than emotional, judicious rather than passionate, inclusive rather than sectarian. In this racial divide, I often find myself critical of both whites and blacks. In the end, I am not for black or white, nor even for the United States of America, but for the whole of humanity. I can't define myself finally as an African American or an American. My humanity comes first. I have felt that way since I have known myself, and I hope to die that way. After my AIDS announcement on April 7th, 1992, I was angry for several days. Although my anger at being outed was real and intense, it quickly began to ebb. After all, I am not one to bank and store rage. Instead, I want its fire to go out as soon as possible and cool reason to return. Within 2 or 3 weeks, anger on this score passed out of me entirely, or almost entirely, as I turned to the new stage of my life. In one respect, I was relieved by my announcement. No longer would I have to make different excuses to different people about lapses in my health, as I had been doing since 1988. Nor did I have to deny being ill, as I had often done. Now I could tell the truth when my body hurt or failed me, and also talk about particular nuances of my illness. For this freedom, I was truly grateful. Because this latest stage of my life opened almost without warning, at first I felt in danger of being overwhelmed by the publicity. More than ever before, the world wanted to hear from me. Requests for speeches more than tripled. Invitations to functions, to dinners, award ceremonies, and the like also increased dramatically. Here I saw something of a dilemma. On the one hand, the last thing I wanted to do was to dine out on my story of AIDS. On the other hand, I was bent on telling the story of AIDS so that as many people as possible would be aware of its dangers, its myths, and realities. I made up my mind neither to withdraw from the world nor to turn bashfully from the limelight. Unless I fell severely ill and became gaunt and wasted, as many AIDS patients do, I would not become a recluse. How much time I had left, I did not know. No doctor could tell me. In the first 2 or 3 years of knowing I had AIDS, I could argue to myself that I might defeat it, that with the right combination of medical help and mental and physical toughness, I might be one of the first to beat the odds and survive it, or survive for so many years that I could claim a victory over the disease. Already, in fact, the medical community saw me as a long-term survivor. However, I could not ignore the fact that AIDS, as well as heart disease, was exacting a heavy toll on my body. My weight was down, perhaps irremediably so. At 6 feet 1 inch, I now weighed just over 140 pounds. In my playing days, I weighed just over 150 pounds. My stamina, too, was impaired. I had no time to waste. As I settled deeper into this new stage of my life, I became increasingly conscious of a certain thrill, an exhilaration even, about what I was doing. Yes, I felt pain, physical and psychological, but I also felt something like pleasure in responding purposefully, vigorously, to my illness. I had lost many matches on the tennis court, but I had seldom quit. I was losing, but playing well now. My head was down, eyes riveted on the ball as I stroked it. I had to be careful, but I could not be tentative, and my follow-through flowed from the shot, fluid and graceful. Experience as an athlete had taught me that in times of danger I had to respond with confidence, authority, and grace. So many looming defeats had turned strangely, sometimes even miraculously, into victories as I applied that lesson to the task before me. Following my announcement, one of my most important decisions was to establish the Arthur Ashe Foundation for the Defeat of AIDS. I was conscious of the possibility that I did not have sufficient time left to mount such a project, but I became determined to move ahead with it, come what may. Although I could have joined an existing organization, I wanted my foundation to be somewhat more international in scope than any I knew, as befits an epidemic that knows no national boundaries and is ravaging some of the poorest countries of the world. According to the Harvard AIDS Institute, by the year 2000, as many as 110 million people around the world may be infected. The plight of patients in Africa is particularly terrible. Nations such as the Central Africa Republic, Uganda, Kenya, Zaire, and Zambia loom as major sites of AIDS devastation, with the average cost of treating a patient in the United States now about $100,000 from diagnosis to death. It is clear that many people, perhaps most, will simply die untreated. I decided that my foundation would keep these tragic facts in mind in the hope that it could contribute to lessening the dimensions of this global disaster. Accordingly, I decided that at least half of the money we raise will go to AIDS research and treatment outside the United States. As a matter of policy, we would work with and through respected organizations such as the International Red Cross and the World Health Organization of the United States. We would guard our resources carefully and do everything we could to ensure that the maximum part of each contribution went to alleviate the suffering of AIDS patients, or by promoting some vital aspect of AIDS research. To many people, especially to people who meet me or even those who merely find themselves in the same room with me, I probably personify the problem of AIDS. When I am there with them, they can't avert their eyes and look elsewhere, but must face the problem that has been facing them for years and will face them even more boldly in the future. I do not like being the personification of a problem, much less a problem involving a killer disease. But I know I must seize these opportunities to spread the word. Talking to audiences about AIDS has become, in some respects, the most important function of my life. On December 1st, 1992, at the invitation of Secretary General Boutros Ghali, I addressed the United Nations on the occasion of World AIDS Day. I considered that speech one of the most significant of my life, perhaps even the most significant. In it, I stressed the formidable power of AIDS, but also deplored the weakness of the effort against it. It has been the habit of humankind, I noted, to wait until the 11th hour to spiritually commit ourselves to those problems which we knew all along to be of the greatest urgency. In the face of a pandemic, we could hesitate no longer. In the United States and around the world, a variety of reactionary attitudes impeded the fight against AIDS. Nevertheless, I insisted, we must try, and we must succeed, or our children and grandchildren will one day rightfully ask us why, in the face of such a calamity, we did not give our best efforts. What shall we tell them, and their mothers in particular, if we don't measure up? How shall I answer to my 6-year-old daughter? And what do we say to the estimated 10 million AIDS orphans by the year 2000? That their parents' generation was so racked with political and cultural and religious discord that it was willing to needlessly condone millions of medical refugees? I ended by expressing optimism that AIDS would be finally defeated. We want to be able to look back and say to all concerned that we did what we had to do, when we had to do it, and with all the resources required. As Christmas drew near, I had every reason to be happy. The Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year award brought a spate of publicity, including appearances on ABC's Good Morning America show and with Tom Brokaw on NBC. On December 21st, Camera celebrated her birthday with a party which I not only attended, but also videotaped. The party proved something of a trial, however. Walking through the streets, lugging the video camera proved more onerous than I had thought. At least I was sure that the weight of the video camera was the source of my discomfort. I was left feeling weak and tired, so that I did little for the next 2 days. Then on Christmas Eve around noon, tired of being housebound, I went out for a walk in the neighborhood. I was startled by how freezing cold the air was. I walked for about 20 minutes, but after 5 minutes I began to regret having come out at all. I was frozen to the bone and gasping for air. Christmas found me not very well, but I was buoyed by the joyous reaction of camera to her presence, and by the telephone calls that came from family and friends. Still, I was not well enough to do what has become for me in some respects the most important ritual of the day. When I was a boy on Christmas, my father always took me late in the day to visit families who were less fortunate than we were. We brought food and toys, and Daddy always insisted that we give away not simply old toys, but 1 or 2 of the new toys we had just received. I have continued this tradition with camera. For the past 3 Christmas days, we have gone to Harlem late in the day and visited the hospitals and given away toys, old and new. But I couldn't do it this year. I was not well enough. So I was glad the next day when Jean, Camera, and I flew south to Miami and the Florida sun. Down there at the Doral Resort and Country Club with our friends and family, we would ring out the old year, which had been so packed with events, some of them momentous. And we would ring in 1993 with kisses, hugs, and sips of wine, and the hope, always the hope, for a bright and healthy and prosperous new year. The year 1993 did not start well. In fact, New Year's Day found me ill at ease, hurting, coughing, and feverish, on an airplane bringing my family back a day early from Miami. I had planned to work hard while in Florida. My main task there would be to teach my annual Christmas tennis clinic at the Doral, where I am now the international tennis director, having relinquished my leadership on the main tennis program some time ago. I looked forward to working diligently with the guests, but I also hoped to squeeze in as many rounds of golf as I could, on one or another of the 4 excellent courses at the Doral. In fact, I was out on the golf course with Jean's father, John Matusame, and a Canadian friend, Stanley Kavenko, when I first noticed that I was having some difficulty breathing. I couldn't understand why. We were riding comfortably from tee to tee in a golf cart, so there was no reason for me to feel tired. Then I started to cough. The cough persisted. From the 7th green, as I waited to putt, I took out my cellular telephone and called my main AIDS physician, Dr. Henry Murray in New York. He advised me to see a doctor as soon as possible. Later that day, I went to see my AIDS physician in Miami, Dr. Barry Baker. After examining me, he ordered a chest X-ray. It revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, I went to Miami Baptist Hospital to seek the advice of Dr. Michael Collins. 14 years ago, in New York, Dr. Collins had treated me for the heart disease that had started my sorry medical record. He examined me and ordered an echocardiogram, which uses sound waves to study the action of the heart. At this point, I still assumed that the cause of my shortness of breath was a lack of blood going to the heart, depriving the heart of oxygen. After his examination and the echocardiogram, however, Dr. Collins decided that the problem was not with the heart, but in my lungs. What exactly was wrong, he couldn't say. On New Year's Eve morning, I went out for my last day of tennis clinics for the Doral. Even with my cough and chest pains, I looked forward to a full 2 days of golf before we headed back to the wintry cold of New York. After my last clinic, I headed for the links. I played a decent round, but found myself depending on a golf cart to move myself to the ball. I was beginning to recognize that in addition to anginal discomfort, the mere act of drawing air into my lungs was causing me some pain. I certainly could not take any deep breaths. That evening, Jean, Camera, and I went to dinner in the hotel coffee shop with Jean's parents, 2 of their friends, her brother Claude, and her sister-in-law. After dinner, we all went over to Claude's home to bring in the new year. But midnight did not find me there. At some point, after watching me try to breathe without discomfort, Jean suggested that we head back to New York the next day, if she could arrange a flight. I agreed to do so, and around 10:30 we left Claude's so that we could call the airlines and pack. I was drowsy again when I reached our room, but Camera insisted that we turn on the television and watch the ball drop in Times Square to ring in the new year. Although the hour was late, way past her bedtime, Jean and I had no trouble giving in to her, and we enthusiastically joined the countdown into 1993. Then we all went happily to sleep. At 5 in the morning, I awoke with a start. I was on fire, burning up. I took my temperature, 101.9 degrees. Around 8 in the morning, Jean called Dr. Murray in New York. He advised that we should see a doctor in Miami, but we both wanted to return home that day. With the aid of nothing more exotic than extra-strength Tylenol, I brought down my temperature and relieved the other symptoms sufficiently to fly back to New York. From the airport, I went straight to New York Hospital where Dr. Murray was waiting for me. His examination did not settle the matter. Speculating that I probably had a form of atypical pneumonia, he put me on a powerful antibiotic, azithromycin. I started with 2 huge red capsules, then continued taking the drug through the weekend. It had no effect on me whatsoever. More feverish than ever, coughing badly and miserable, I returned to the hospital on Monday. I saw Dr. Thomas King, a pulmonary specialist, who ordered a bronchoscopy. This procedure alone could give the answers we wanted. The procedure lasted between 30 and 40 minutes. As he watched the television monitor, Dr. King spoke into a microphone and recorded his observations. That is how I found out I was suffering from the dreaded PCP, or Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, about which I knew something. PCP is the major killer of patients from AIDS. Thus far, aside from the toxoplasmosis that uncovered the fact that I have AIDS, I had avoided every one of the opportunistic diseases that, in combination with the presence of HIV in the body, define the condition known as AIDS. Now I had one of the most feared. Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is a very rare form of pneumonia, found in the past mainly among traditionally impoverished East European immigrants with already severely compromised immune systems. The disease acquired a fresh notoriety with AIDS. In fact, my shivering and burning fever were trademarks of PCP infection. Fortunately, Dr. Murray assured me my case was not particularly serious. I would definitely survive this bout. A New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center was in the forefront in the world in research on this disease. 8 years ago, I probably would have been dead by this time. On the 16th floor of a wing of New York Hospital, I sat in a room named after the late Greek shipping magnate Stavros Niarchos. I didn't ask for the room. It was assigned to me. Undoubtedly, it was the most luxurious hospital room I had ever had, and I have had quite a few. Apart from an intravenous feeding stand parked discreetly in a corner, my iron bed, mechanized and grimly practical, was perhaps the sole reminder that I was in a hospital. Dr. David E. Rogers, one of the most eminent teaching physicians there, stopped by to see me one morning. "Beautiful room," he said. "Yes," I responded, "it's really special. I remember this room from my early days here as a doctor. In fact, I had a patient in here once, a young senator, John F. Kennedy, no less. That was a long time ago." On a table in my room, coincidentally, was an invitation to the inauguration of President William Jefferson Clinton on Wednesday, January 20th. I was touched and grateful to be invited, but I did not plan to go. I would not have attended the event even if I had been well, which I was not. I looked forward to going home to Jean and camera and spending a few days in quiet reading and reflection while my strength returned. I meant no offense or criticism of the pomp and splendor of the inauguration. I was a Clinton supporter, and I am happy to see him president. But I wanted to be in my own home. Stan Smith called, and we talked about tennis matters, which had seemed far away until then. We talked about a certain controversial father of a certain promising young woman tennis player. Some people find the man offensive, even obnoxious because of his often harsh behavior both to his daughter's opponents and to the young woman herself. Because of him, the tennis establishment may move to curb the behavior of relatives of tennis players. After the telephone call, I lay in bed and thought about tennis. The behavior of some adults is quite amazing. I remember one day years ago at the Doral in Florida, almost coming to blows with a father. We had organized an informal tennis tournament for kids staying at the resort. One boy, about 11 years old, fought hard but lost his match. He walked off the court disconsolately. I watched him go up to his father, who promptly punched him in the head. I was stunned. "Don't do that," I said. quietly but as sternly as I could. He turned and glared at me. "Who the hell are you," he said, "to tell me what to do to my kid? Do it again and I'll have you evicted from this place." "How dare you threaten me," he shouted. "I'll report you to the manager." "I hope you do," I said. "You'll be out of here a lot faster." People like that sometimes destroy the joy of sport and the joy in the lives of young people. Victory in a tennis match, money won in a tournament, these are not so important as good health, the honest affection and respect of friends, the love of one's wife or husband, and the spicy innocence of one's child or children. I also remember one evening with Jean and Camera at a hotel in Eleuthera, the Bahamas. We were under the stars, the hour was late, way past 10 o'clock, and Camera was still up, but what did we care? She was happy after a day in the sun and the sea, and now she was dancing to the music of a calypso band with a little friend she had just met. Jean was happy too, talking easily to the wife of a musician she had met earlier in our stay and liked at once. I was with them, but alone. As I sat in an armchair watching my little daughter dance and my wife's face sparkle with life and joy, a wave of emotion like one of the waves of the ocean a few feet away from us washed over me, and I started to cry. I cried quietly, but Jean turned her face and saw me. The smile left her face, but then it quickly returned. Not the same kind of smile, but another, because she knew that at that moment I was happy. She knew I was crying not only out of sorrow, but also out of joy, and that joy was so powerful that it hurt. My joy was that I was there, on that beach under those stars, listening to that music and watching the two people I loved more than anyone or anything in the world, and I did not want that feeling of perfect joy ever to end. There, in the corner room of the 16th floor of the hospital, as I kept company with the memory or the spirit or perhaps only the ghost of John F. Kennedy, I knew that what matters are the consolations of life. What else do you have to sustain you in the dark hours? These days I read even more than usual, and I listen to music much of the time. I've always been an avid reader of books and also of newspapers and magazines of all types. I like to know something about everything, from economics and geography to science and philosophy. I want information not to enliven exchanges at dinner parties or in some other way to show off my collection of facts before less informed people, but because, as I tell myself, if I am proud to be a citizen of the world, I must know as much as possible about the world. Lately, however, I have spent more time reading the Bible than any other single book. I began reading the Bible when I was young, a long time before my illness. Now, not surprisingly, its words appeal to me more than ever. Quite often, people who mean well inquire of me whether I ever ask myself in the face of my diseases, why me? I never do. If I ask, why me, as I am assaulted by heart disease and AIDS, I must also ask why me about my blessings, and question my right to enjoy them. The morning after I won Wimbledon in 1975, I should have asked, why me? And doubted that I deserved the victory. If I don't ask why me after my victories, I cannot ask why me after my setbacks and tragedies. I also do not waste time pleading with God to make me well. I was brought up to believe that prayer is not to be invoked to ask God for things for oneself or even for others. Rather, prayer is a medium through which I ask God to show me God's will and to give me strength to carry out that will. God's will alone matters, not my personal desires or needs. When I played tennis, I never prayed for victory in a match. I will not pray now to be cured of heart disease or AIDS. I do not brood on the prospect of dying soon. I am not afraid of death. Perhaps fear will come to haunt me when the moment of death is closer. On the other hand, perhaps I will be even less fearful, more calm and at peace. I think of my lack of fear as being in some ways different from true courage. My bouts of surgery have made me a veteran in fighting death. Familiarity has not bred contempt of death, but has given me practice in learning to face it calmly. So I go calmly on with my life. Keeping as busy as my health allows, I press on with my modest efforts at striving and achieving. I am a fortunate, blessed man. Aside from AIDS and heart disease, I have no problems. My stepmother, about whom I care deeply both for my sake and for my dead father's, is in fine health. My wife is in fine health. My daughter radiates vitality. I have loving friends in abundance. I have the support of skilled doctors and nurses. I need nothing that money can buy. So why should I complain? And beyond them, I know I have God to help me. My dear Camera, by the time you read this letter from me to you, for the first time, I may not be around to discuss with you what I have written here. Perhaps I will still be with you and your mother, sharing in your daily lives, in your joys and in your sorrows. However, I may be gone. You would doubtless be sad that I am gone and remember me clearly for a while. Then I will exist only as a memory already beginning to fade in your mind. Although it is natural for memories to fade, I am writing this letter in the hope that your recollection of me will never fade completely. I would like to remain a part of your life, Camera, for as long as you live. Coincidentally, Camera, I am writing this letter to you on the same day as the inauguration in Washington, D.C., just a few hours after William Jefferson Clinton became the new President of the United States of America. I've been watching much of the pomp and pageantry on the television in my study. I especially loved listening to Maya Angelou, tall and dignified and with a rich, melodious voice, read the poem that our new president asked her to write especially for this occasion. Tears came to my eyes as I watched her conjure up symbols and allusions generations old in the African-American world, as she sought to describe the nature of life and to challenge humanity to do better. She spoke of a rock, a river, a tree, as sites in and of the earth, which over time have witnessed the sweep of recorded and unrecorded history. For me, the river and the tree hold special significance as symbols because they are so much a part of African-American folklore and history, its religion and culture in the South where I was born and grew up, and where so many other black folk have lived in slavery and freedom. As a boy not much older than you, one of the most haunting spirituals I heard on many a Sunday morning in church spoke movingly of a rest beyond the river. These words and music meant that no matter how harsh and unrelenting life on earth may have been for us as slaves, or in what passed for our freedom, once we have crossed the river, that is death, we will find on the other side God's promise of eternal peace. The river is death, and yet it is also life. Rivers flow forever and are ever-changing. At no 2 moments in time is a river the same. The water in the river is always changing. Life is like that, Maya Angelou wisely reminded us today at the inauguration. What is sure to be different for you will be the quickening pace of change as you grow older. Believe me, most people resist change, even if it promises to be for the better. But change will come. And if you acknowledge this simple but indisputable fact of life and understand that you must adjust to all change, then you will have a head start. I want you to use that advantage, to become a leader among people and never to lag behind and follow the selfish wishes and snares of others. On the other hand, Camera, certain things do not change. They are immutable. Maya Angelou's tree stands for family, both immediate and extended. You are part of a tree. I saw my father lose his own father and his wife, my mother, in less than 1 year. Those were terrible blows. And ever since then, family has meant more to me than you can imagine. When I think of the many horrors of slavery, the destruction of the family strikes me as probably the worst. In all likelihood, you too will one day have your own family, which will enrich your life and bring so much pleasure in knowing that the tree is still alive, still growing. Marriage will probably be the second most important decision of your life. The most important, I think, will be your decision about having a child. Today, about half of all marriages end in divorce, which is a sad and frightening thought. This means that you must choose a husband carefully, Camera. 2 parents are usually better for a child. If you had children out of wedlock, as an increasing number of women have chosen to do, I would not be pleased, although I would still love you. I only wish that you could be as fortunate in your choice of a spouse as your mother and I were when we chose one another. No marriage is without problems, as two individuals learn to adapt their ways for the sake of harmony. But your mother and I love one another passionately, and we were never more in love than when you came into our lives to enrich and complete our sense of family. Camera, because of the color of your skin and the fact that you are a girl, not a boy, your credibility and competence will constantly be questioned, no matter how educated or wealthy you are. At the same time, your brown skin may bring you a few advantages. You should be wary of them. When the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was asked if he should be replaced on retirement from the court by another African American, he replied emphatically, no. It should go to the best qualified person the president can find. That is as it should be. But many people in the world are not colorblind. Unlike you, I grew up under the laws of segregation. My classmates and I were reminded every day that we had to resist the worst temptation facing us, despair. If racism was so pervasive, why should we try to do our best at anything? Why study hard? I tell you, Camera, racism and sexism must never be an excuse for not doing your best. Racism and sexism will probably always exist, but you must always try to rise above them. You must also learn to feel comfortable in any company as long as those people are good people. Traveling the world as a tennis player, I discovered that deep friendships with an infinite variety of people are not only possible, but can definitely enrich one's life beyond measure. Do not hem yourself in or allow others to do so. The United States of America is your country, Camera. Some people will tell you that it's theirs alone, not yours to share. Don't believe them. I remember the presidential election of 1960 when the Protestant denominations feared that if John F. Kennedy, a Catholic, won, he would force his religion on everyone else, which, by the way, is precisely what the Protestants have tried to do since the founding of the Republic. Certain Americans believe that they have an almost divine or historical right to determine our nation's future. As the free-thinking adult I hope you will become, you must not back off from this debate. Pay attention to your health, Camera, and do not take it for granted. Whatever else you learn in school, I would like you to master at least 2 life sports. Those you can play long after you are out of school. Sports are wonderful. They can bring you comfort and pleasure for the rest of your life. Sports can teach you so much about yourself, your emotions, and character, how to be resolute in moments of crisis, and how to fight back from the brink of death. Not right now, but in a few short years, you will begin to take an increasing interest in boys. In your rush to be treated as an adult, you may want to try supposedly adult things: driving, staying out late, drinking alcohol, indulging in drugs, gambling, and sex. As your father, I am particularly concerned about alcohol, drugs, and sex. I have seen so many lives ruined by alcohol that they must be mentioned separately. Because it is so widely accepted and so easily available, alcohol in particular can be a curse. In our family, Camera, several people were alcoholics, and they and others suffered terribly as a result. Sex is one of God's precious gifts, which is not to be treated cavalierly by men or women. When it is time, choose your partner and the occasion with care. Do not allow yourself to be seduced and then cast off and forgotten, as many women tragically are. Last of all, I want you to nurture an appreciation of music and the arts. When I was young, I played in my junior high school and high school band for 6 years and developed a love of music and a persisting wonder that human beings can create and execute such wonderful melodies and harmonies. I have always been moved by art and by poetry. Don't let anyone tell you that either is frivolous or expendable or inferior to making money. Without either, and music, life would be dry and without feeling. Art comes from an urge as primal as that of survival itself. Camera, have faith in God. Do not be tempted either by pleasures and material possessions, or by the claims of science and smart thinkers into believing that religion is obsolete, that the worship of God is somehow beneath you. Spiritual nourishment is as important as physical nourishment or intellectual nourishment. The religion you choose is not nearly as important as a fundamental faith in God. Be ruled by that rule called golden. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Camera, as frenzied as is my world, yours will feel even more hurried and frantic. Technology is expanding as never before. The instruments of change are everywhere. You will often feel that you don't have time to do what you want to do. Make time. Control time. Do not let time control you any more than it must. Do not try to do everything. Choose carefully. And then give your all to what you choose. And please, try to become an expert at something, so that others will look to you as a human resource. I end Camera as I began, with family. In nearly every civilization of which I have heard, the family is the central social unit, the base and foundation of the culture. You are a member of the 11th identifiable generation of a family on my side, and the 4th generation on your mother's side. We have tried to prepare you as best we can to lead as happy and productive a life as possible. Along the way you will stumble and perhaps even fall, but that too is normal and to be expected. Get up, get back on your feet, chastened but wiser, and continue on down the road. I may not be walking with you all the way, or even much of the way, as I walk with you now. Don't be angry with me if I am not there in person, alive and well when you need me. I would like nothing more than to be with you always. Do not feel sorry for me if I am gone. When we were together, I loved you deeply, and you gave me so much happiness I can never repay you. Camera, wherever I am when you read this, or when you stumble and fall, and don't know if you can get up again, think of me. I will be watching and smiling, and cheering you on.
This has been a Random House Audiobooks presentation.